Chapter 1, Book 7. It will perhaps appear to the readers of the preceding book that, professing only to write of the affairs of Florence, I have dilated too much in speaking of those which occurred in Lombardy and Naples. But as I have not already avoided, so it is not my intention in future to forbear similar digressions. For although we have not engaged to give an account of the affairs of Italy, still it would be improper to neglect noticing the most remarkable of them. If they were wholly omitted, our history would not be so well understood. Neither would it be so instructive or agreeable, since from the proceedings of the other princes and states of Italy have most commonly arisen those wars in which the Florentines were compelled to take part. Thus, from the war between John of Anjou and King Ferrando originated those serious enmities and hatreds which ensued between Ferrando and the Florentines, particularly the house of Medici. The king complained of a want of assistance during the war, and of the aid afforded to his enemy, and from his anger originated the greatest evils, as will be hereafter seen. Having, in speaking of external affairs, come down to the year 1463, it will be necessary, in order to make our narrative of the contemporaneous domestic transactions clearly understood, to revert to a period several years back. But first, according to custom, I would offer a few remarks referring to the events about to be narrated, and observe that those who think a republic may be kept in perfect unity of purpose are greatly deceived. True it is that some divisions injure republics, while others are beneficial to them. When accompanied by factions and parties, they are injurious, but when maintained without them, they contribute to their prosperity. The legislator of a republic, since it is impossible to prevent the existence of dissensions, must at least take care to prevent the growth of faction. It may therefore be observed that citizens acquire reputation and power in two ways, the one public, the other private. Influence is acquired publicly by winning a battle, taking possession of a territory, fulfilling the duties of an embassy with care and prudence, or by giving wise counsel attended by a happy result. Private methods are conferring benefits upon individuals, defending them against the magistrates, supporting them with money, and raising them to undeserved honors, or with public games and entertainments gaining the affection of the populace. This mode of procedure produces parties and cliques, and in proportion as influence thus acquired is injurious, so is the former beneficial, if quite free from party spirit, because it is founded upon the public good and not upon private advantage. And though it is impossible to prevent the existence of inveterate feuds, still if they be without partisans to support them for their own individual benefit, they do not injure a republic, but contribute to its welfare. Since none can attain distinction, but as he contributes to her good, and each party prevents the other from infringing her liberties. The dissensions of Florence were always accompanied by factions, and were therefore always pernicious, and the dominant party only remained united so long as its enemies held it in check. As soon as the strength of the opposition was annihilated, the government, deprived of the restraining influence of its adversaries, and being subject to no law, fell to pieces. The party of Cosmo de' Medici gained the ascendant in 1434, but the depressed party, being very numerous and composed of several very influential persons, fear kept the former united, and restrained their proceedings within the bounds of moderation, so that no violence was committed by them, nor anything done calculated to excite popular dislike. Consequently, whenever this government required the citizens' aid to recover or strengthen its influence, the latter were always willing to gratify its wishes, so that from 1434 to 1455, during a period of 21 years, the authority of a balia was granted to it 6 times. There were in Florence, as we have frequently observed, 2 principally powerful citizens, Cosmo de' Medici and Neri Capponi. Neri acquired his influence by public services, so that he had many friends but few partisans. Cosmo, being able to avail himself both of public and private means, had many partisans as well as friends. While both lived, having always been united, they obtained from the people whatever they required, for in them popularity and power were united. But in the year 1455, Neri being dead, and the opposition party extinct, the government found a difficulty in resuming its authority, and this was occasioned remarkably enough by Cosmo's private friends and the most influential men in the state for not fearing the opposite party. They became anxious to abate his power. This inconsistency was the beginning of the evils which took place in 1456, so that those in power were openly advised in the deliberative councils not to renew the power of the Balia, but to close the balloting purses and appoint the magistrates by drawing from the pollings or squatini previously made. To restrain this disposition, Cosmo had the choice of two alternatives, either forcibly to assume the government with the partisans he possessed and drive out the others, or to allow the matter to take its course and let his friends see they were not depriving him of power, but rather themselves. He chose the latter, for he well knew that at all events, the purses being filled with the names of his own friends, he incurred no risk, and could take the government into his own hands whenever he found occasion. The chief offices of state being again filled by lot, the mass of the people began to think they had recovered their liberty, and that the decisions of the magistrates were according to their own judgments, unbiased by the influence of the great. At the same time, the friends of different grandees were humbled, and many who had commonly seen their houses filled with suitors and presents found themselves destitute of both. Those who had previously been very powerful were reduced to an equality with men whom they had been accustomed to consider inferior, and those formerly far beneath them were now become their equals. No respect or deference was paid to them. They were often ridiculed and derided, and frequently heard themselves and the republic mentioned in the open streets, without the least deference. Thus they found it was not Cosmo, but themselves that had lost the government. Cosmo appeared not to notice these matters, and whenever any subject was proposed in favor of the people, he was the first to support it. But the greatest cause of alarm to the higher classes, and his most favorable opportunity of retaliation, was the revival of the catasto or property tax of 1427, so that individual contributions were determined by statute, and not by a set of persons appointed for its regulation. This law being reestablished, and a magistracy created to carry it into effect, the nobility assembled, and went to Cosmo to beg he would rescue them and himself from the power of the plebeians, and restore to the government the reputation which had made himself powerful, and them respected. He replied he was willing to comply with their request, but wished the law to be obtained in the regular manner, by consent of the people, and not by force, of which he would not hear on any account. They then endeavored in the councils to establish a new balia, but did not succeed. On this the grandees again came to Cosmo, and most humbly begged he would assemble the people in a general council or parliament. But this he refused, for he wished to make them sensible of their great mistake. And when Donato Cocchi, being gonfalonier of justice, proposed to assemble them without his consent, the singers who were of Cosmo's party ridiculed the idea so unmercifully that the man's mind actually became deranged, and he had to retire from office in consequence. However, since it is undesirable to allow matters to proceed beyond recovery, the gonfalon of justice being in the hands of Luca Pitti, a bold-spirited man, Cosmo determined to let him adopt what course he thought proper, that if any trouble should arise it might be imputed to Luca, and not to himself. Several times proposed to the people the appointment of a new balia, and, not succeeding, he threatened the members of the councils with injurious and arrogant expressions, which were shortly followed by corresponding conduct. For in the month of August, 1458, on the eve of St. Lorenzo, having filled the piazza, and compelled them to assent to a measure to which he knew them to be averse, having recovered power, created a new balia, and filled the principal offices according to the pleasure of a few individuals, in order to commence that government with terror which they had obtained by force, they banished Girolamo Machiavelli with some others, and deprived many of the honors of government. Girolamo, having transgressed the confines to which he was limited, was declared a rebel. Traveling about Italy with the design of exciting the princes against his country, he was betrayed while at Lunigiana, and being brought to Florence was put to death in prison. This government, during the 8 years it continued, was violent and insupportable. For Cosmo, being now old, and through ill health unable to attend to public affairs as formerly, Florence became a prey to a small number of her own citizens. Luca Pitti, in return for the services he had performed for the Republic as Meta Knight, and to be no less grateful than those who had conferred the dignity upon him, he ordered that the priors, who had hitherto been called priors of the trades, should also have a name to which they had no kind of claim, and therefore called them priors of liberty. He also ordered that, as it had been customary for the gonfalonier to sit upon the right hand of the rectors, he should in future take his seat in the midst of them, and that the deity might appear to participate in what had been done, public processions were made, and solemn services performed, to thank him for the recovery of the government. The Signory and Cosmo made Luca Pitti rich presents, and all the citizens were emulous in imitation of them, so that the money given amounted to no less a sum than 20,000 ducats. He thus attained such influence, that not Cosmo, but himself now, governed the city, and his pride so increased that he commenced 2 superb buildings, one in Florence, the other at Rusciano, about a mile distant, both in a style of royal magnificence, that in the city being larger than any hitherto built by a private person. To complete them, he had recourse to the most extraordinary means, for not only citizens and private individuals made him presents and supplied materials, but the mass of people of every grade also contributed. Besides this, any exiles who had committed murders, thefts, or other crimes which made them amenable to the laws, found a safe refuge within their walls, if they were able to contribute toward their decoration or completion. The other citizens, though they did not build like him, were no less violent or rapacious, so that if Florence were not harassed by external wars, she was ruined by the wickedness of her own children. During this period, the wars of Naples took place. The Pope also commenced hostilities in Romagna against the Malatesti, from whom he wished to take Rimino and Cesena held by them. In these designs and his intentions of a crusade against the Turks was passed the pontificate of Pius II. Florence continued in disunion and disturbance. The dissensions continued among the party of Cosmo in 1455 from the causes already related, which by his prudence, as we have also before remarked, he was enabled to tranquilize. But in the year 1464 his illness increased and he died. Friends and enemies alike grieved for his loss, for his political opponents, perceiving the rapacity of the citizens, even during the life of him who alone restrained them and made their tyranny supportable, were afraid lest after his decease nothing but ruin would ensue. Nor had they much hope of his son Piero, who, though a very good man, was of infirm health, and new in the government, and they thought he would be compelled to give way, so that, being unrestrained, their rapacity would pass all bounds. On these accounts the regret was universal, of all who had left memorials behind them, and who were not of the military profession. Cosmo was the most illustrious and the most renowned. He not only surpassed all his contemporaries in wealth and authority, but also in generosity and prudence, and among the qualities which contributed to make him prince in his own country was his surpassing all others in magnificence and generosity. His liberality became more obvious after his death, when Piero, his son, wishing to know what he possessed, it appeared there was no citizen of any consequence to whom Cosmo had not lent a large sum of money, and often, when informed of some nobleman being in distress, he relieved him unasked. His magnificence is evident from the number of public edifices he erected. For in Florence are the convents and churches of St. Marco and St. Lorenzo, and the monastery of Santa Verdiana, in the mountains of Fiesole, the church and abbey of St. Girolamo. And in the Mugello he not only restored, but rebuilt from its foundation, a monastery of the Frati Minori, or Minims. Besides these, in the church of Santa Croce, the Servi, the Agnoli, and in San Miniato, he erected splendid chapels and altars. And besides building the churches and chapels we have mentioned, he provided them with all the ornaments, furniture, and utensils suitable for the performance of divine service. To these sacred edifices are to be added his private dwellings, one in Florence of extent and elegance, adapted to so great a citizen, and 4 others situated at Correggi, Fiesole, Cagliulo, and Trebbio, each for size and grandeur equal to royal palaces. And as if it were not sufficient to be distinguished for magnificence of buildings in Italy alone, he erected an hospital at Jerusalem for the reception of poor and infirm pilgrims. although his habitations, like all his other works and actions, were quite of a regal character, and he alone was prince in Florence. Still everything was so tempered with his prudence that he never transgressed the decent moderation of civil life, in his conversation, his servants, his traveling, his mode of living, and the relationships he formed. The modest demeanor of the citizen was always evident, for he was aware that a constant exhibition of pomp brings more envy upon its possessor than greater realities born without ostentation. Thus, in selecting consorts for his sons, he did not seek the alliance of princes, but for Giovanni chose Corniglia degli Alessandri, and for Piero, Lucrezia de Tornabuoni. He gave his granddaughters, the children of Piero Bianca, to Guglielmo de Pazzi, and Nanina to Bernardo Rucellai. No one of his time possessed such an intimate knowledge of government and state affairs as himself. And hence, amid such a variety of fortune in a city so given to change, and among a people of such extreme inconstancy, he retained possession of the government 31 years, for being endowed with the utmost prudence. He foresaw evils at a distance, and therefore had an opportunity either of averting them or preventing their injurious results. He thus not only vanquished domestic and civil ambition, but humbled the pride of many princes with so much fidelity and address that whatever powers were in league with himself and his country either overcame their adversaries or remained uninjured by his alliance, and whoever were opposed to him lost either their time, money, or territory. Of this the Venetians afford a sufficient proof, who, while in league with him against Duke Filippo, were always victorious, but apart from him were always conquered, first by Filippo and then by Francesco. When they joined Alfonso against the Florentine Republic, Cosmo, by his commercial credit, so drained Naples and Venice of money that they were glad to obtain peace upon any terms it was thought proper to grant. Whatever difficulties he had to contend with, whether within the city or without, he brought to a happy issue, at once glorious to himself and destructive to his enemies, so that civil discord strengthened his government in Florence, and war increased his power and reputation abroad. He added to the Florentine dominions the Borgo of St. Sepolcro, Montedoglio, de Casentino, and Val di Bagna. His virtue and good fortune overcame all his enemies and exalted his friend. He was born in the year 1389 on the day of the Saints Cosmo in Damiano. His earlier years were full of trouble, as his exile, captivity, and personal danger fully testify. And having gone to the Council of Constance with Pope John, in order to save his life after the ruin of the latter, he was obliged to escape in disguise. But after the age of 40, he enjoyed the greatest felicity, and not only those who assisted him in public business, but his agents who conducted his commercial speculations throughout Europe participated in his prosperity. Hence many enormous fortunes took their origin in different families of Florence, as in that of the Tornabuoni, the Benci, the Portinari, and the Sassetti. Besides these, all who depended upon his advice and patronage became rich, and, though he was constantly expending money in building churches and in charitable purposes, he sometimes complained to his friends that he had never been able to lay out so much in the service of God as to find the balance in his own favor, intimating that all he had done or could do was still unequal to what the Almighty had done for him. He was of middle stature, olive complexion, and venerable aspect, not learned but exceedingly eloquent, endowed with great natural capacity, generous to his friends, kind to the poor, comprehensive in discourse, cautious in advising, and in his speeches and replies grave and witty. When Rinaldo degli Albizzi, at the beginning of his exile, sent to him to say, "The hen had laid," he replied, "she did ill to lay so far from the nest." Some other of the rebels gave him to understand they were not dreaming. He said he believed it, for he had robbed them of their sleep. When Pope Pius was endeavoring to induce the different governments to join in an expedition against the Turks, he said, he was an old man, and had undertaken the enterprise of a young one, to the Venetians' ambassadors, who came to Florence with those of King Alfonso to complain of the Republic. He uncovered his head and asked them what color it was. They said white. He replied, "It is so, and it will not be long before your senators have heads as white as mine." A few hours before his death, his wife asked him why he kept his eyes shut, and he said, to get them in the way of it, some citizens saying to him, after his return from exile, that he injured the city, and that it was offensive to God to drive so many religious persons out of it, he replied that it was better to injure the city than to ruin it, that 2 yards of rose-colored cloth would make a gentleman, and that it required something more to direct a government than to play with a string of beads. These words gave occasion to his enemies to slander him, as a man who loved himself more than his country, and was more attached to this world than to the next. Many others of his sayings might be adduced, but we shall omit them as unnecessary. Cosmo was a friend and patron of learned men. He brought Argyropolo, a Greek by birth, and one of the most erudite of his time, to Florence to instruct the youth in Hellenic literature, and being much attached to him, have him a residence near his palace at Careggi, that he might pursue the study of letters with greater convenience, and himself have an opportunity of enjoying his company, his prudence, his great wealth. The uses to which he applied it, and his splendid style of living caused him to be beloved and respected in Florence, and obtained for him the highest consideration, not only among the princes and governments of Italy, but throughout all Europe. He thus laid a foundation for his descendants, which enabled them to equal him in virtue and greatly surpass him in fortune, while the authority they possessed in Florence and throughout Christendom was not obtained without being merited. Toward the close of his life he suffered great affliction, for of his 2 sons, Piero and Giovanni the latter, of whom he entertained the greatest hopes, died. And the former was so sickly as to be unable to attend either to public or private business. On being carried from one apartment to another after Giovanni's death, he remarked to his attendants with a sigh, "This is too large a house for so small a family." His great mind also felt distressed at the idea that he had not extended the Florentine dominions by any valuable acquisition, and he regretted it the more from imagining he had been deceived by Francesco Sforza, who, while Count, had promised that if he became Lord of Milan, he would undertake the conquest of Lucca for the Florentines, a design, however, that was never realized. For the Count's ideas changed upon his becoming Duke, he resolved to enjoy in peace the power he had acquired by war, and would not again encounter its fatigues and dangers unless the welfare of his own dominions required it. This was a source of much annoyance to Cosmo, who felt he had incurred great expense and trouble for an ungrateful and perfidious friend. His bodily infirmities prevented him from attending either to public or private affairs, as he had been accustomed, and he consequently witnessed both going to decay, for Florence was ruined by her own citizens, and his fortune by his agents and children. He died, however, at the zenith of his glory and in the enjoyment of the highest renown. The city and all the Christian princes condoled with his son Piero for his loss. His funeral was conducted with the utmost pomp and solemnity, the whole city following his corpse to the tomb in the church of St. Lorenzo, on which, by public decree, he was inscribed, Father of his country. If, in speaking of Cosmo's actions, I rather imitated the biographies of princes than general history, it need not occasion wonder, for of so extraordinary an individual I was compelled to speak with unusual praise. Chapter 2, Book 7. While Florence and Italy were in this condition, Louis de Velden, of France, was involved in very serious troubles with his barons who, with the assistance of Francis, Duke of Brittany, and Charles, Duke of Burgundy, were in arms against him. This attack was so serious that he was unable to render further assistance to John of Anjou in his enterprise against Genoa and Naples, and standing in need of all the forces he could raise. He gave over Savona, which still remained in the power of the French, to the Duke of Milan, and also intimated that if he wished, he had his permission to undertake the conquest of Genoa. Francesco accepted the proposal, and with the influence afforded by the king's friendship and the assistance of the Adorni, he became Lord of Genoa. In acknowledgment of this benefit, he sent 1,500 horse into France for the king's service, under the command of Galeazzo, his eldest son. Thus Ferrando of Aragon and Francesco Sforza became the latter Duke of Lombardy and Prince of Genoa, and the former sovereign of the whole kingdom of Naples. Their families being allied by marriage, they thought they might so confirm their power as to secure to themselves its enjoyment during life, and at their deaths its unencumbered reversion to their heirs. To attain this end, They considered it necessary that the king should remove all ground of apprehension from those barons who had offended him in the war of John of Anjou, and that the duke should extirpate the adherents of the Bracceschi, the natural enemies of his family who, under Jacopo Piccinino, had attained the highest reputation. The latter was now the first general in Italy, and possessing no territory. He naturally excited the apprehension of all who had dominions, and especially of the duke, who, conscious of what he had himself done, thought he could neither enjoy his own estate in safety, nor leave them with any degree of security to his son during Jacopo's lifetime. The king, therefore, strenuously endeavored to come to terms with his barons, and using his utmost ingenuity to secure them, succeeded in his object, for they perceived their ruin to be inevitable if they continued in war with their sovereign. Though from submission and confidence in him, they would still have reason for apprehension. Mankind are always most eager to avoid a certain evil, and hence inferior powers are easily deceived by princes. The barons, conscious of the danger of continuing the war, trusted the king's promises, and having placed themselves in his hands, they were soon after destroyed in various ways and under a variety of pretexts. This alarmed Jacopo Piccinino, who was with his forces at Sulmona, and to deprive the king of the opportunity of treating him similarly, he endeavored by the mediation of his friends to be reconciled with the duke, who, by the most liberal offers, induced Jacopo to visit him at Milan, accompanied by only 100 horse. Jacopo had served many years with his father and brother, first under Duke Filippo, and afterward under the Milanese Republic, so that by frequent intercourse with the citizens he had acquired many friends and universal popularity, which present circumstances tended to increase, for the prosperity and newly acquired power of the Sforzeschi had occasioned envy, while Jacopo's misfortunes and long absence had given rise to compassion and a great desire to see him. These various feelings were displayed upon his arrival, for nearly all the nobility went to meet him. The streets through which he passed were filled with citizens, anxious to catch a glimpse of him, while shouts of the Bracceschi resounded on all sides. These honors accelerated his ruin, for the duke's apprehensions increased his desire of destroying him. And to effect this with the least possible suspicion, Jacopo's marriage with Drusiana, the duke's natural daughter, was now celebrated. The duke then arranged with Ferrando to take him into pay, with the title of captain of his forces, and give him 100 florins for his maintenance. After this agreement, Jacopo, accompanied by a ducal ambassador and his wife Drusiana, proceeded to Naples, where he was honorably and joyfully received, and for many days entertained with every kind of festivity. But having asked permission to go to Sulmona, where his forces were, the king invited him to a banquet in the castle, at the conclusion of which he and his son Francesco were imprisoned, and shortly afterward put to death. It was thus our Italian princes, fearing those virtues in others which they themselves did not possess, extirpated them, and hence the country became a prey to the efforts of those by whom it was not long afterward oppressed and ruined. At this time Pope Pius II, having settled the affairs of Romagna and witnessing a universal peace, thought it a suitable opportunity to lead the Christians against the Turks, and adopted measures similar to those which his predecessors had used. All the princes promised assistance either in men or money, while Matthias, King of Hungary, and Charles, Duke of Burgundy, intimated their intention of joining the enterprise in person, and were by the Pope appointed leaders of the expedition. The pontiff was so full of expectation that he left Rome and proceeded to Ancona, where it had been arranged that the whole army should be assembled, and the Venetians engaged to send ships thither to convey the forces to Sclavonia. Upon the arrival of the Pope in that city, there was soon such a concourse of people that in a few days all the provisions it contained, or that could be procured from the neighborhood, were consumed, and famine began to impend. Besides this, there was no money to provide those who were in want of it, nor arms to furnish such as were without them. Neither Matthias nor Charles made their appearance. The Venetians sent a captain with some galleys, but rather for ostentation and the sake of keeping their word than for the purpose of conveying troops. During this position of affairs, The Pope, being old and infirm, died, and the assembled troops returned to their homes. The death of the pontiff occurred in 1465, and Paul II, of Venetian origin, was chosen to succeed him, and that nearly all the principalities of Italy might change their rulers about the same period. In the following year, Francesco Sforza, Duke of Milan, also died, having occupied the dukedom 16 years, and Galeazzo, his son, succeeded him. The death of this prince infused redoubled energy into the Florentine dissensions, and caused them to produce more prompt effects than they would otherwise have done. Upon the demise of Cosmo, his son Piero, being heir to the wealth and government of his father, called to his assistance Diotisalvi Neroni, a man of great influence and the highest reputation, in whom Cosmo reposed so much confidence that just before his death he recommended Piero to be wholly guided by him, both with regard to the government of the city and the management of his fortune. Piero acquired Diotisalvi with the opinion Cosmo entertained of him, and said that, as he wished to obey his father, though now no more, as he always had while alive, he should consult him concerning both his patrimony and the city. Beginning with his private affairs, he caused an account of all his property, liabilities, and assets to be placed in Diotisalvi's hands, that with an entire acquaintance with the state of his affairs, he might be able to afford suitable advice. And the latter promised to use the utmost care. Upon examination of these accounts, the affairs were found to be in great disorder, and Diotisalvi, instigated rather by his own ambition than by attachment to Piero or gratitude to Cosmo, thought he might without difficulty deprive him of both the reputation and the splendor which his father had left him as his inheritance. In order to realize his views, he waited upon Piero, and advised him to adopt a measure which, while it appeared quite correct in itself, and suitable to existing circumstances, involved a consequence destructive to his authority. He explained the disorder of his affairs and the large amount of money it would be necessary to provide, if he wished to preserve his influence in the state and his reputation of wealth, and said there was no other means of remedying these disorders so just and available as to call in the sums which his father had lent to an infinite number of persons, both foreigners and citizens. For Cosmo, to acquire partisans in Florence and friends abroad, was extremely liberal of his money, and the amount of loans due to him was enormous, because he was only desirous to repossess his own property to meet the demands to which he was liable. But as soon as he had ordered those amounts to be recalled, the citizens, as if he had asked for something to which he had no kind of claim, took great offense, loaded him with opprobrious expressions, and accused him of being avaricious and ungrateful. Diotisalvi, noticing the popular excitement against Piero, occasioned by his own advice, obtained an interview with Luca Pitti, Agnolo Acciajuoli, and Niccolò Soderini, and they resolved to unite their efforts to deprive him both of the government and his influence. Each was actuated by a different motive. Luca Pitti wished to take the position Cosmo had occupied, for he was now become so great that he disdained to submit to Piero. Diotisalvi Neroni, who knew Luca unfit to be at the head of a government, thought that of necessity on Piero's removal. The whole authority of the state would devolve upon himself. Niccolò Soderini desired the city to enjoy greater liberty, and for the laws to be equally binding upon all. Agnolo Acciajuoli was greatly incensed against the Medici for the following reasons. His son Raffaello had some time before married Alessandra de Bardi, and received with her a large dowry. Either by her own fault, or the misconduct of others, suffered much ill treatment, both from her father-in-law and her husband, and in consequence Lorenzo di Larion, her kinsman, out of pity for the girl, being accompanied by several armed men, took her away from Agnolo's house. The Acciajuoli complained of the injury done them by the Bardi, and the matter was referred to Cosmo, who decided that the Acciajuoli should restore to Alessandra her fortune, and then leave it to her choice, either to return to her husband or not. Agnolo thought Cosmo had not, in this instance, treated him as a friend, and having been unable to avenge himself on the father, he now resolved to do his utmost to ruin the son. These conspirators, though each was influenced by a different motive from the rest, affected to have only one object in view, which was that the city should be governed by the magistrates and not be subjected to the counsels of a few individuals. The odium against Piero and opportunities of injuring him were increased by the number of merchants who failed about this time, for it was reported that he, in having quite unexpectedly to all resolved to call in his debts, had, to the disgrace and ruin of the city, caused them to become insolvent. To this was added his endeavor to obtain Clarice degli Orsini as wife of Lorenzo, his eldest son, and hence his enemies took occasion to say it was quite clear that, as he despised the Florentine alliance, he no longer considered himself one of the people, and was preparing to make himself prince. For he who refuses his fellow citizens as relatives desires to make them slaves, and therefore cannot expect to have them as friends. The leaders of the sedition thought they had the victory in their power, for the greater part of the citizens followed them, deceived by the name of liberty which they, to give their purpose a graceful covering, adopted upon their ensigns. In this agitated state of the city, some, to whom civil discord was extremely offensive, thought it would be well to endeavor to engage men's minds with some new occupation, because when unemployed they are commonly led by whoever chooses to excite them. To divert their attention from matters of government, it being now a year since the death of Cosmo, it was resolved to celebrate 2 festivals, similar to the most solemn observed in the city. At one of them was represented the arrival of the 3 kings from the east, led by the star which announced the nativity of Christ, which was conducted with such pomp and magnificence, that the preparations for it kept the whole city occupied many months. The other was a tournament, for so they called the exhibition of equestrian combats, in which the sons of the first families in the city took part with the most celebrated cavaliers of Italy. Among the most distinguished of the Florentine youth was Lorenzo, eldest son of Piero, who, not by favor but by his own personal valor, obtained the principal prize. When these festivals were over, the citizens reverted to the same thoughts which had previously occupied them, and each pursued his ideas with more earnestness than ever. Serious differences and troubles were the result, and these were greatly increased by 2 circumstances, one of which was that the authority of the Balia had expired, the other that upon the death of Duke Francesco Galeazzo, the new duke sent ambassadors to Florence to renew the engagements of his father with the city, which, among other things, provided that every year a certain sum of money should be paid to the duke. The principal opponents of the Medici took occasion from this demand to make public resistance in the councils on pretense that the alliance was made with Francesco and not Galeazzo, so that Francesco being dead, the obligation had ceased, nor was there any necessity to revive it, because Galeazzo did not possess his father's talents, and consequently they neither could nor ought to expect the same benefits from him. That if they had derived little advantage from Francesco, they would obtain still less from Galeazzo, and that if any citizen wished to hire him for his own purposes, it was contrary to civil rule, and inconsistent with the public liberty. Piero, on the contrary, argued that it would be very impolite to lose such an alliance from mere avarice, and that there was nothing so important to the Republic and to the whole of Italy as their alliance with the Duke, that the Venetians, while they were united, could not hope either by feigned friendship or open war to injure the duchy. But as soon as they perceived the Florentines alienated from him, they would prepare for hostilities, and finding him young new in the government and without friends, they would either by force or fraud compel him to join them, in which case ruin of the Republic would be inevitable. The arguments of Piero were without effect, and the animosity of the parties began to be openly manifested in their nocturnal assemblies, the friends of the Medici meeting in the Crocetta, and their adversaries in the Pieta. The latter, being anxious for Piero's ruin, had induced many citizens to subscribe their names as favorable to the undertaking. Upon one occasion, particularly when considering the course to be adopted, although all agreed that the power of the Medici ought to be reduced, different opinions were given concerning the means by which it should be effected. One party, the most temperate and reasonable, held that as the authority of the Balia had ceased, they must take care to prevent its renewal. It would then be found to be the universal wish that the magistrates and councils should govern the city, and in a short time Piero's power would be visibly diminished, and As a consequence of his loss of influence in the government, his commercial credit would also fail, for his affairs were in such a state that if they could prevent him from using the public money, his ruin must ensue. They would thus be in no further danger from him, and would succeed in the recovery of their liberty without the death or exile of any individual. But if they attempted violence, they would incur great dangers. For mankind are willing to allow one who falls of himself to meet his fate, but if pushed down, they would hasten to his relief, so that if they adopted no extraordinary measures against him, he will have no reason for defense or aid. And if he were to seek them, it would be greatly to his own injury, by creating such a general suspicion as would accelerate his ruin, and justify whatever course they might think proper to adopt. Many of the assembly were dissatisfied with this tardy method of proceeding. They thought delay would be favorable to him and injurious to themselves. For if they allowed matters to take their ordinary course, Pyrrho would be in no danger whatever, while they themselves would incur many. For the magistrates who were opposed to him would allow him to rule the city, and his friends would make him a prince, and their own ruin would be inevitable, as happened in 1458. And though the advice they had just heard might be most consistent with good feeling, the present would be found to be the safest. That it would therefore be best, while the minds of men were yet excited against him, to effect his destruction. It must be their plan to arm themselves and engage the assistance of the Marquis of Ferrara, that they might not be destitute of troops, and if a favorable signory were drawn, they would be in condition to make use of them. They therefore determined to wait the formation of the new signory, and be governed by circumstances. Among the conspirators was Niccolò Fedini, who had acted as president of their assemblies. He, being induced by most certain hopes, disclosed the whole affair to Pyrrho, and gave him a list of those who had subscribed their names, and also the conspirators. Pyrrho was alarmed on discovering the number and quality of those who were opposed to him, and by the advice of his friends, he resolved to take the signatures of those who were inclined to favor him. Having employed one of his most trusty confidants to carry his design into effect, he found so great a disposition to change and instability that many who had previously set down their names among the number of his enemies now subscribed them in his favor. Chapter 3. Book 7. In the midst of these events, the time arrived for the renewal of the supreme magistracy, and Niccolò Soderini was drawn Gonfalonier of Justice. It was surprising to see by what a concourse not only of distinguished citizens, but also of the populace, he was accompanied to the palace, and while on the way thither, an olive wreath was placed upon his head, to signify that upon him depended the safety and liberty of the city. This, among many similar instances, serves to prove how undesirable it is to enter upon office or power exciting inordinate expectations, for being unable to fulfill them, many looking for more than it is possible to perform. Shame and disappointment are the ordinary results. Tommaso and Niccolò Soderini were brothers. Niccolò was the more ardent and spirited, Tommaso the wiser man, who, being very much the friend of Pyrrho, and knowing that his brother desired nothing but the liberty of the city, and the stability of the republic, without injury to any, advised him to make new squittini, by which means the election purses might be filled with the names of those favorable to his design. Niccolò took his brother's advice, and thus wasted the period of his magistracy in vain hopes, which his friends, the leading conspirators, allowed him to do from motives of envy, for they were unwilling that the government should be reformed by the authority of Niccolò, and thought they would be in time enough to effect their purpose under another Gonfalonier. Thus the magistracy of Niccolò expired, and having commenced many things without completing aught, he retired from office with much less credit than when he had entered upon it. This circumstance caused the aggrandizement of Pyrrho's party, whose friends entertained stronger hopes, while those who had been neutral or wavering became his adherents, so that both sides being balanced, many months elapsed without any open demonstration of their particular designs. Pyrrho's party continuing to gather strength, his enemies' indignation increased in proportion, and they now determined to effect by force what they either could not accomplish, or were unwilling to attempt by the medium of the magistrates. which was assassination of Piero, who lay sick at Correggi, and to this end order the Marquis of Ferrara nearer to the city with his forces, that after Piero's death he might lead them into the piazza, and thus compel the Signory to form a government according to their own wishes. For though all might not be friendly, they trusted they would be able to induce those to submit by fear who might be opposed to them from principle. Diotisalvi, the better to conceal his design, frequently visited Piero, conversed with him respecting the union of the city, and advised him to effect it. The conspirators' designs had already been fully disclosed to Piero. Besides this, Domenico Martelli had informed him that Francesco Neroni, the brother of Diotisalvi, had endeavored to induce him to join them, assuring him the victory was certain, and their object all but attained. Upon this, Piero resolved to take advantage of his enemy's tampering with the Marquis of Ferrara, and be first in arms. He therefore intimated that he had received a letter from Giovanni Bentivoglio, Prince of Bologna, which informed him that the Marquis of Ferrara was upon the river Alboa at the head of a considerable force, with the avowed intention of leading it to Florence, that upon this advice he had taken up arms, after which, in the midst of a strong force, he came to the city when all who were disposed to support him armed themselves also. The adverse party did the same, but not in such good order, being unprepared. The residence of Diotisalvi being near that of Piero, he did not think himself safe in it, but first went to the palace and begged the Signory would endeavor to induce Piero to lay down his arms, and thence to Luca Pitti to keep him faithful in their cause. Niccolò Soderini displayed the most activity, for taking arms and being followed by nearly all the plebeians in his vicinity, he proceeded to the house of Luca, and begged that he would mount his horse and come to the piazza in support of the Signory, who were, he said, favorable, and that the victory would undoubtedly be on their side. That he should not stay in the house to be basely slain by their armed enemies, or ignominiously deceived by those who were unarmed, for in that case he would soon repent of having neglected an opportunity irrecoverably lost. That if he desired the forcible ruin of Piero, he might easily effect it, and that if he were anxious for peace, it would be far better to be in a condition to propose terms than to be compelled to accept any that might be offered. These words produced no effect upon Luca, whose mind was now quite made up. He had been induced to desert his party by new conditions and promises of alliance from Piero, for one of his nieces had been married to Giovanni Tornabuoni. He therefore advised Niccolò to dismiss his followers and return home, telling him he ought to be satisfied if the city were governed by the magistrates, which would certainly be the case, and that all ought to lay aside their weapons for the Signory. Most of whom were friendly would decide their differences. Niccolò, finding him impracticable, returned home. But before he left, he said, "I can do the city no good alone, but I can easily foresee the evils that will befall her. This resolution of yours will rob our country of her liberty. You will lose the government, I shall lose my property, and the rest will be exiled." During this disturbance, the Signory closed the palace and kept their magistrates about them. Without showing favor to either party, the citizens, especially those who had followed Luca Pitti, finding Piero fully prepared and his adversaries unarmed, began to consider not how they might injure him, but how, with least observation, glide into the ranks of his friends. The principal citizens, the leaders of both factions, assembled in the palace in the presence of the Signory and spoke respecting the state of the city and the reconciliation of parties. And as the infirmities of Piero prevented him from being present, they, with one exception, unanimously determined to wait upon him at his house. Niccolò Soderini, having first placed his children and his effects under the care of his brother Tommaso, withdrew to his villa, there to await the event, but apprehended misfortune to himself and ruin to his country. The other citizens, coming into Piero's presence, one of them, who had been appointed spokesman, complained of the disturbances that had arisen in the city, and endeavored to show that those must be most to blame who had been first to take up arms. And not knowing what Piero, who was evidently the first to do so, intended, they had come in order to be informed of his design, and if it had in view the welfare of the city, they were desirous of supporting it. Piero replied, that not those who first take arms are the most to blame, but those who give the first occasion for it. and if they would reflect a little on their mode of proceeding toward himself, they would cease to wonder at what he had done. For they could not fail to perceive that nocturnal assemblies, the enrollment of partisans, and attempts to deprive him both of his authority and his life, had caused him to take arms, and they might further observe that as his forces had not quitted his own house, his design was evidently only to defend himself and not to injure others. He neither sought nor desired anything but safety and repose. Neither had his conduct ever manifested a desire for aught else. For when the authority of the baillie expired, he never made any attempt to renew it, and was very glad the magistrates had governed the city, and had been content. They might also remember that Cosmo and his sons could live respected in Florence, either with the balia or without it, and that in 1458 it was not his family, but themselves who had renewed it. That if they did not wish for it at present, neither did he. But this did not satisfy them, for he perceived that they thought it impossible to remain in Florence while he was there. It was entirely beyond all his anticipations that his own or his father's friends should think themselves unsafe with him in Florence, having always shown himself quiet and peaceable. He then addressed himself to Diotisalvi and his brothers, who were present, reminding them with grave indignation of the benefits they had received from Cosmo, the confidence he had reposed in them and their subsequent ingratitude, and his words so strongly excited some present that had he not interfered, they would certainly have torn the Neroni to pieces on the spot. He concluded by saying that he should approve of any determination of themselves and the Signory, and that for his own part he only desired peace and safety. After this many things were discussed, but nothing determined, excepting generally, that it was necessary to reform the administration of the city and government. The gonfalon of justice was then in the hands of Bernardo Lotti, a man not in the confidence of Piero, who was therefore disinclined to attempt aught while he was in office. But no inconvenience would result from the delay, as his magistracy was on the point of expiring. Upon the election of signers for the months of September and October 1466, Roberto Lioni was appointed to the supreme magistracy, and as soon as he assumed its duties, every requisite arrangement having been previously made, the people were called to the piazza, and a new balia created wholly in favor of Piero, who soon afterward filled all the offices of government according to his own pleasure. These transactions alarmed the leaders of the opposite faction, and Agnolo Asciagioli fled to Naples, Diotisalvi Neroni and Niccolò Soderini to Venice. Luca Pitti remained in Florence, trusting to his new relationship. The refugees were declared rebels, and all the family of the Neroni were dispersed. Giovanni di Neroni, then Archbishop of Florence, to avoid a greater evil, became a voluntary exile at Rome, and to many other citizens who fled, various places of banishment were appointed, nor was this considered sufficient. For it was ordered that the citizens should go in solemn procession to thank God for the preservation of the government and the reunion of the city, during the performance of which some were taken and tortured, and part of them afterward put to death and exiled. In this great vicissitude of affairs, there was not a more remarkable instance of the uncertainty of fortune than Luca Pitti, who soon found the difference between victory and defeat, honor and disgrace. His house now presented only a vast solitude, where previously crowds of citizens had assembled. In the streets his friends and relatives, instead of accompanying, were afraid even to salute him. Some of them were deprived of the honors of government, others of their property, and all alike threatened. The superb edifices he had commenced were abandoned by the builders. The benefits that had been conferred upon him were now exchanged for injuries, the honors for disgrace. Hence many of those who had presented him with articles of value now demanded them back again, as being only lent, and those who had been in the habit of extolling him as a man of surpassing excellence now termed him violent and ungrateful, so that, when too late, he regretted not having taken the advice of Niccolò Soderini, and preferred an honorable death in battle than to a life of ignominy among his victorious enemies. The exiles now began to consider various means of recovering that citizenship which they had not been able to preserve. However, Agnolo Acciajuoli, being at Naples, before he attempted anything else, resolved to sound Piero, and try if he could effect a reconciliation. For this purpose, He wrote to him in the following terms: I cannot help laughing at the freaks of fortune, perceiving how, at her pleasure, she converts friends into enemies and enemies into friends. You may remember that, during your father's exile, regarding more the injury done to him than my own misfortunes, I was banished and in danger of death, and never during Cosmo's life failed to honor and support your family. Neither have I since his death ever entertained a wish to injure you. True it is that your own sickness and the tender years of your sons so alarmed me that I judged it desirable to give such a form to the government, that after your death our country might not be ruined, and hence the proceedings which, not against you, but for the safety of the state, have been adopted, which, if mistaken, will surely obtain forgiveness, both for the good design in view, and on account of my former services. Neither can I apprehend that your house, having found me so long faithful, should now prove unmerciful, or that you could cancel the impression of so much merit for so small a fault. Pyrrho replied, Your laughing in your present abode is the cause why I do not weep. For were you to laugh in Florence, I should have to weep at Naples. I confess you were well disposed toward my father, and you ought to confess you were well paid for it, and the obligation is so much the greater on your part than on ours, as deeds are of greater value than words. Having been recompensed for your good wishes, it ought not to surprise you that you now receive the due reward of your bad ones. Neither will a pretense of your patriotism excuse you, for none will think the city less beloved or benefited by the Medici than by the Acciajuoli. It therefore seems but just that you should remain in dishonor at Naples, since you knew not how to live with honor at home. Agnolo, hopeless of obtaining pardon, went to Rome, where, joining the archbishop and other refugees, they used every available means to injure the commercial credit of the Medici in that city. Their attempts greatly annoyed Pyrrho, but by his friend's assistance he was enabled to render them abortive. Diotisalvi Neroni and Niccolò Soderini strenuously urged the Venetian Senate to make war upon their country, calculating that in case of an attack, the government, being new and unpopular, would be unable to resist. At this time there resided at Ferrara Giovanni Francesco, son of Palestrozzi, who with his father was banished from Florence in the changes of 1434. He possessed great influence and was considered one of the richest merchants. The newly banished pointed out to Giovanni Francesco how easily they might return to their country, if the Venetians were to undertake the enterprise, and that it was most probable they would do so if they had pecuniary assistance, but that otherwise it would be doubtful. Giovanni Francesco, wishing to avenge his own injuries, at once fell in with their ideas, and promised to contribute to the success of the attempt all the means in his power. On this they went to the Doge, and complained of the exile they were compelled to endure for no other reason. They said then for having wished their country should be subject to equal laws, and that the magistrates should govern, not a few private individuals. That Piero de' Medici, with his adherents, who were accustomed to act tyrannically, had secretly taken up arms, deceitfully induced them to lay their own aside, and thus, by fraud, expelled them from their country. That, not content with this, they made the Almighty himself a means of oppression to several who, trusting to their promises, had remained in the city and were there betrayed. For, during public worship and solemn supplications, that the deity might seem to participate in their treachery, many citizens had been seized, imprisoned, tortured, and put to death, thus affording to the world a horrible and impious precedent. To avenge themselves for these injuries, they knew not where to turn with so much hope of success as to the Senate, which, having always enjoyed their liberty, ought to compassionate those who had lost it. They therefore called upon them as free men to assist them against tyrants, as pious against the wicked, and would remind the Venetians that it was the family of the Medici who had robbed them of their dominions in Lombardy, contrary to the wish of the other citizens, and who, in opposition to the interests of the Senate, had favored and supported Francesco, so that if the exiles' distresses could not induce them to undertake the war, the just indignation of the people of Venice and their desire of vengeance ought to prevail. Chapter 4, Book 7. The concluding words of the Florentine exiles produced the utmost excitement among the Venetian senators, and they resolved to send Bernardo Coglione, their general, to attack the Florentine territory. The troops were assembled and joined by Ercole da Este, who had been sent by Borgo, Marquis of Ferrara. At the commencement of hostilities, the Florentines not being prepared, their enemies burned the Borgo of Dovadola and plundered the surrounding country, but having expelled the enemies of Piero, renewed their league with Galeazzo, Duke of Milan. And Ferrando, King of Naples, they appointed to the command of their forces Federigo, Count of Urbino, and being thus on good terms with their friends, their enemies occasioned them less anxiety. Ferrando sent Alfonso, his eldest son, to their aid, and Galeazzo came in person, each at the head of a suitable force, and all assembled at Castrocaro, a fortress belonging to the Florentines, and situated among the roots of the Apennines which descend from Tuscany to Romagna. In the meantime, the enemy withdrew toward Imola. A few slight skirmishes took place between the armies, yet, in accordance with the custom of the times, neither of them acted on the offensive, besieged any town, or gave the other an opportunity of coming to a general engagement, but each kept within their tents and conducted themselves with most remarkable cowardice. This occasioned general dissatisfaction among the Florentines, for they found themselves involved in an expensive war from which no advantage could be derived. The magistrates complained of these spiritless proceedings to those who had been appointed commissaries to the expedition, but they replied that the entire evil was chargeable upon the Duke Galeazzo, who, possessing great authority and little experience, was unable to suggest useful measures, and unwilling to take the advice of those who were more capable, and therefore any demonstration of courage or energy would be impracticable so long as he remained with the army. Hereupon the Florentines intimated to the Duke that his presence with the force was in many ways advantageous and beneficial, and of itself sufficient to alarm the enemy, but they considered his own safety and that of his dominions much more important than their own immediate convenience, because so long as the former were safe, the Florentines had nothing to fear, and all would go well, but if his dominions were to suffer, they might then apprehend all kinds of misfortune. They assured him they did not think it prudent for him to be absent so long from Milan, having recently succeeded to the government, and being surrounded by many powerful enemies and suspected neighbors, while any who were desirous of plotting against him had an opportunity of doing so with impunity. They would, therefore, advise him to return to his territories, leaving part of his troops with them for the use of the expedition. This advice pleased Galeazzo, who in consequence immediately withdrew to Milan. The Florentine generals being now left without any hindrance, to show that the cause assigned for their inaction was the true one, pressed the enemy more closely, so that they came to a regular engagement which continued half a day. Without either party yielding, some horses were wounded and prisoners taken, but no death occurred. Winter having arrived, and with it the usual time for armies to retire into quarters, Bartolomeo Coglione withdrew to Ravenna, the Florentine forces into Tuscany, and those of the king and duke each to the territories of their sovereign. As this attempt had not occasioned any tumult in Florence, contrary to the rebels' expectation, and the troops they had hired were in want of pay, terms of peace were proposed and easily arranged. The revolted Florentines, thus deprived of hope, dispersed themselves in various places. Diotisalvi Neroni withdrew to Ferrara, where he was received and entertained by the Marquis Borso. Niccolò Soderini went to Ravenna, where, upon a small pension allowed by the Venetians, he grew old and died. He was considered a just and brave man, but overcautious and slow to determine, a circumstance which occasioned him, when Gonfalonier of Justice, to lose the opportunity of victory, which he would have gladly recovered when too late. Upon the restoration of peace, those who remained victorious in Florence, as if unable to convince themselves they had conquered, unless they oppressed not merely their enemies, but all whom they suspected, prevailed upon Bardo Altaviti, then Gonfalonier of Justice, to deprive many of the honors of government and to banish several more. They exercised their power so inconsiderately and conducted themselves in such an arbitrary manner that it seemed as if fortune and the Almighty had given the city up to them for a prey. Piero knew little of these things and was unable to remedy even the little he knew on account of his infirmities, his body being so contracted that he could use no faculty but that of speech. All he could do was to admonish the leading men and beg they would conduct themselves with greater moderation, and not by their violence affect their country's ruin. In order to divert the city, he resolved to celebrate the marriage of his son Lorenzo with Clarice degli Orsini with great splendor, and it was accordingly solemnized with all the displays suitable to the exalted rank of the parties. Feasts, dancing, and antique representations occupied many days, at the conclusion of which, to exhibit the grandeur of the House of Medici and of the government, 2 military spectacles were presented, one performed by men on horseback, who went through the evolutions of a field engagement, and the other representing the storming of a town, everything being conducted with admirable order and the greatest imaginable brilliancy. During these transactions in Florence, the rest of Italy, though at peace, was filled with apprehension of the power of the Turks, who continued to attack the Christians, and had taken Negropont, to the great disgrace and injury of the Christian name. About this time died Borso, Marquis of Ferrara, who was succeeded by his brother Ercole. Gismondo da Rimini, the inveterate enemy of the church, also expired, and his natural brother Roberto, who was afterward one of the best generals of Italy, succeeded him. Pope Paul died and was succeeded by Sixtus IV, previously called Francesco da Savona, a man of the very lowest origin, who by his talents had become General of the Order of St. Francis, and afterward Cardinal. He was the first who began to show how far a pope might go, and how much that which was previously regarded as sinful lost its iniquity when committed by a pontiff. Among others of his family were Piero and Girolamo, who, according to universal belief, were his sons, though he designated them by terms reflecting less scandal on his character. Piero, being a priest, was advanced to the dignity of a cardinal with the title of Saint Sixtus. To Girolamo he gave the city of Furli, taken from Antonio Ordelaffi, whose ancestors had held that territory for many generations. This ambitious method of procedure made him more regarded by the princes of Italy, and all sought to obtain his friendship. The Duke of Milan gave his natural daughter Caterina to Girolamo with the city of Imola, which he had taken from Taddeo degli Alidosi as her portion. New matrimonial alliances were formed between the Duke and King Ferrando, Elisabetta, daughter of Alfonso, the king's eldest son, being united to Giovan Galeazzo, the eldest son of the Duke. Italy being at peace, the principal employment of her princes was to watch each other and strengthen their own influence by new alliances, leagues, or friendships. But in the midst of this repose, Florence endured great oppression from her principal citizens, and the infirmities of Piero incapacitated him from restraining their ambition. However, to relieve his conscience, and if possible, to make them ashamed of their conduct, he sent for them to his house, and addressed them in the following words: "I never thought a time would come when the behavior of my friends would compel me to esteem and desire the society of my enemies, and wish that I had been defeated rather than victorious, for I believe myself to be associated with those who would set some bounds to their avarice, and who, after having avenged themselves on their enemies, and lived in their country with security and honor, would be satisfied. But now I find myself greatly deceived, unacquainted with the ambition of mankind, and least of all with yours, for not satisfied with being masters of so great a city, and possessing among yourselves those honors, dignities, and emoluments which used to be divided among many citizens, not contented with having shared among a few the property of your enemies, or with being able to oppress all others with public burdens, while you yourselves are exempt from them, and enjoy all the public offices of profit, you must still further load everyone with ill usage. You plunder your neighbors of their wealth, you sell justice, you evade the law, you oppress the timid and exalt the insolent. Nor is there throughout all Italy so many and such shocking examples of violence and avarice as in this city. Has our country fostered us only to be her destroyer? Have we been victorious only to effect her ruin? Has she honored us that we may overwhelm her with disgrace? Now, by that faith which is binding upon all good men, I promise you, that if you still conduct yourselves so as to make me regret my victory, I will adopt such measures as shall cause you bitterly to repent of having misused it." The reply of the citizens accorded with the time and circumstances, but they did not forego their evil practices, so that in consequence Piero sent for Agnolo Acciajuoli to come secretly to Cafaggiolo, and discussed with him at great length the condition of the city, and doubtless, had he not been prevented by death, he would have called home the exiles as a check upon the rapine of the opposite party. But these honorable designs were frustrated, for, sinking under bodily infirmities and mental anguish, he expired in the 53rd year of his age. His goodness and virtue were not duly appreciated by his country, principally from his having, until almost the close of his life, been associated with Cosmo, and the few years he survived being spent in civil discord and constant debility. Piero was buried in the church of St. Lorenzo, near his father, and his obsequies were performed with all the pomp and solemnity due to his exalted station. He left 2 sons, Lorenzo and Giuliano, whose extreme youth excited alarm in the minds of thinking men, though each gave hopes of future usefulness to the Republic. Among the principal citizens in the government of Florence, and very superior to the rest, was Tommaso Soderini, whose prudence and authority were well known not only at home, but throughout Italy. After Piero's death, the whole city looked up to him. Many citizens waited upon him at his own house, as the head of the government, and several princes addressed him by letter, but he, impartially estimating his own fortune and that of the house of Medici, made no reply to the prince's communications, and told the citizens it was not his house, but that of the Medici they ought to visit. To demonstrate by his actions the sincerity and integrity of his advice, he assembled all the heads of noble families in the convent of St. Antonio, whither he also brought Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici. And in a long and serious speech upon the state of the city, the condition of Italy, and the views of her princes, he assured them that if they wished to live in peace and unity in Florence, free both from internal dissensions and foreign wars, it would be necessary to respect the sons of Piero and support the reputation of their house. For men never regret their continuance in a course sanctioned by custom, while new methods are soon adopted and as speedily set aside. And it has always been found easier to maintain a power which by its continuance has outlived envy than to raise a new one which innumerable unforeseen causes may overthrow. When Tommaso had concluded, Lorenzo spoke, and though young, with such modesty and discretion that all present felt a presentiment of his becoming what he afterward proved to be. And before the citizens departed, they swore to regard the youths as their sons, and the brothers promised to look upon them as their parents. After this, Lorenzo and Giuliano were honored as princes, and resolved to be guided by the advice of Tommaso Soderini. While profound tranquillity prevailed both at home and abroad, no wars disturbing the general repose, there arose an unexpected disturbance, which came like a presage of future evils. Among the ruined families of the party of Luca Pitti was that of the Nardi. For Salvestro and his brothers, the heads of the house, were banished, and afterward declared rebels for having taken part in the war under Bartolomeo Coglione. The brother of Salvestro was young, prompt, and bold, and on account of his poverty being unable to alleviate the sorrows of exile. While the peace extinguished all hopes of his return to the city, he determined to attempt some means of rekindling the war. For a trifling commencement often produces great results, and men more readily prosecute what has already begun than originate new enterprises. Bernardo had many acquaintances at Prato, and still more in the district of Pistoia, particularly among the Palandra, a family which, though rustic, was very numerous, and like the rest of the Pistolesi, brought up to slaughter and war. These he knew to be discontented on account of the Florentine magistrates having endeavored, perhaps too severely, to check their partiality for inveterate feuds and consequent bloodshed. He was also aware that the people of Prato considered themselves injured by the pride and avarice of their governors, and that some were ill-disposed toward Florence. Therefore, all things considered, he hoped to be able to kindle a fire in Tuscany, should Prato rebel, which would be fostered by so many, that those who might wish to extinguish it would fail in the attempt. He communicated his ideas to Salvi Neroni and asked him, in case they should succeed in taking possession of Prato, what assistance might be expected from the princes of Italy by his means. Salvi considered the enterprise as eminently dangerous and almost impracticable, but since it presented a fresh chance of attaining his object, at the risk of others, he advised him to proceed, and promised certain assistance from Bologna and Ferrara, if he could retain Prato not less than 15 days. Bernardo, whom this promise inspired with a lively hope of success, proceeded secretly to Prato, and communicated with those most disposed to favor him, among whom were the Palandra, and having arranged the time and plan, informed Diotisalvi of what had been done. Chapter 5, Book 7. Cesare Petrucci held the office of Provost of Prato for the Florentine people at this period. It is customary with governors of towns similarly situated to keep the keys of the gates near their persons, and whenever at peaceful times they are required by any of the inhabitants for entrance or exit, they are usually allowed to be taken. Bernardo was aware of this custom, and about daybreak presented himself at the gate which looks toward Pistoia, accompanied by the Palandra and about 100 persons, all armed. Their confederates within the town also armed themselves, and one of them asked the governor for the keys, alleging as a pretext that someone from the country wished to enter. The governor, not entertaining the slightest suspicion, sent a servant with them. When at a convenient distance, they were taken by the conspirators, who, opening the gates, introduced Bernardo and his followers. They divided themselves into two parties, one of which, led by Silvestro, an inhabitant of Prato, took possession of the citadel. The other, following Bernardo, seized the palace, and placed Cesare with all his family in the custody of some of their number. They then raised the cry of liberty and proceeded through the town. It was now day, and many of the inhabitants, hearing the disturbance, ran to the piazza, where, learning that the fortress and the palace were taken and the governor with all his people made prisoners, they were utterly astonished, and could not imagine how it had occurred. The 8 citizens, possessing the supreme authority, assembled in their palace to consider what was best to be done. In the meantime, Bernardo and his followers, on going round the town, found no encouragement, and being told that the 8 had assembled, went and declared the nature of their enterprise, which he said was to deliver the country from slavery, reminding them how glorious it would be for those who took arms to effect such an honorable object, for they would thus obtain permanent repose and everlasting fame. He called to recollection their ancient liberty and present condition, and assured them of certain assistance, if they would only for a few days aid in resisting the forces the Florentines might send against them. He said he had friends in Florence who would join them as soon as they found the inhabitants resolved to support him. His speech did not produce the desired effect upon the 8, who replied that they knew not whether Florence was free or enslaved, for that was a matter which they were not called upon to decide. But this they knew very well, that for their own part they desired no other liberty than to obey the magistrates who governed Florence, from whom they had never received any injury sufficient to make them desire a change. They therefore advised him to set the governor at liberty, clear the place of his people, and as quickly as possible withdraw from the danger he had so rashly incurred. Bernardo was not daunted by these words, but determined to try whether fear could influence the people of Prato, since entreaties produced so little effect. In order to terrify them, he determined to put Caesar to death, and having brought him out of prison, ordered him to be hanged at the windows of the palace. He was already led to the spot with a halter around his neck, when seeing Bernardo giving directions to hasten his end, he turned to him and said, "Bernardo, you put me to death, thinking that the people of Prato will follow you, but the direct contrary will result. For the respect they have for the rectors which the Florentine people send here is so great, that as soon as they witness the injury inflicted upon me, they will conceive such a disgust against you as will inevitably effect your ruin. Therefore, it is not by my death, but by the preservation of my life, that you can attain the object you have in view. For if I deliver your commands, they will be much more readily obeyed in following your directions. We shall soon attain the completion of your design." Bernardo, whose mind was not fertile in expedients, thought the advice good, and commanded Caesar, on being conducted to a veranda, which looked upon the piazza, to order the people of Prato to obey him, and having done which, Caesar was led back to prison. The weakness of the conspirators was obvious, and many Florentines residing in the town assembled together, among whom Giorgio Ginori, a knight of Rhodes, took arms first against them, and attacked Bernardo, who traversed the piazza, alternately entreating and threatening those who refused to obey him, and being surrounded by Giorgio's followers, he was wounded and made prisoner. This being done, it was easy to set the governor at liberty and subdue the rest, who, being few and divided into several parties, were nearly all either secured or slain. An exaggerated report of these transactions reached Florence, it being told there that Prato was taken, the governor and his friends put to death, and the place filled with the enemy, and that Pistoia was also in arms and most of the citizens in the conspiracy. In consequence of this alarming account, the palace as quickly filled with citizens who consulted with the signory what course ought to be adopted. At this time, Roberto da San Severino, one of the most distinguished generals of this period, was at Florence, and it was therefore determined to send him, with what forces could be collected, to Prato, with orders that he should approach the place, particularly observe what was going on, and provide such remedies as the necessity of the case and his own prudence should suggest. Roberto had scarcely passed the fortress of Campi when he was met by a messenger from the governor, who informed him that Bernardo was taken, his followers either dispersed or slain, and everything restored to order. He consequently returned to Florence, whither Bernardo was shortly after conveyed, and when questioned by the magistracy concerning the real motives of such a weak conspiracy, he said he had undertaken it, having resolved to die in Florence rather than live in exile. He wished his death to be accompanied by some memorable action. This disturbance having been raised and quelled almost at the same time, the citizens returned to their accustomed mode of life, hoping to enjoy, without anxiety, the state they had now established and confirmed. Hence arose many of those evils which usually result from peace, for the youth having become more dissolute than before, more extravagant in dress, feasting, and other licentiousness, and being without employment, wasted their time and means on gaming and women, their principal study being how to appear splendid in apparel and attain a crafty shrewdness in discourse, he who could make the most poignant remark being considered the wisest, and being most respected. These manners derived additional encouragement from the followers of the Duke of Milan, who with his duchess and the whole ducal court, as it was said, to fulfill a vow, came to Florence, where he was received with all the pomp and respect due to so great a prince, and one so intimately connected with the Florentine people. Upon this occasion, the city witnessed an unprecedented exhibition, for during Lent, when the Church commands us to abstain from animal food, the Milanese, without respect for either God or his Church, ate of it daily. Many spectacles were exhibited in honor of the Duke, and among others in the temple of Santo Spirito was represented the descent of the Holy Ghost among the apostles, and in consequence of the numerous fires used upon the occasion, some of the woodwork became ignited, and the church was completely destroyed by the flames. Many thought that the Almighty, being offended at our misconduct, took this method of signifying his displeasure. If, therefore, the Duke found the city full of courtly delicacies and customs unsuitable to well-regulated conduct, he left it in a much worse state. Hence the good citizens thought it necessary to restrain these improprieties, and made a law to put a stop to extravagance in dress, feasts, and funerals. In the midst of this universal peace, a new and unexpected disturbance arose in Tuscany. Certain citizens of Volterra had discovered an alum mine in their district, and being aware of the profit derivable from it, in order to obtain the means of working and securing it, they applied to some Florentines, and allowed them to share in the profits. This, as is frequently the case with new undertakings, at first excited little attention from the people of Volterra, but in time, finding the profits derived from it had become considerable, they fruitlessly endeavored to effect what at first might have been easily accomplished. They began by agitating the question in their councils, declaring it grossly improper that a source of wealth discovered in the public lands should be converted to the emolument of private individuals. They next sent advocates to Florence, and the question was referred to the consideration of certain citizens who, either through being bribed by the party in possession or from a sincere conviction, declared the aim of the people of Volterra to be unjust in desiring to deprive their citizens of the fruit of their labor, and decided that the alum pit was the rightful property of those who had hitherto wrought it. But at the same time, recommended them to pay an annual sum by way of acknowledgment to the city. This answer, instead of abating, served only to increase the animosities and tumult in Volterra, and absorbed entire attention both in the councils and throughout the city. The people demanding the restitution of what they considered their due, and the proprietors insisting upon their right to retain what they had originally acquired, and what had been subsequently been confirmed to them by the decision of the Florentines. In the midst of these disturbances, a respectable citizen named Il Pecorino was killed, together with several others, who had embraced the same side, whose houses were also plundered and burned, and the fury of the mob rose to such a height that they were with difficulty restrained from putting the Florentine rectors to death. After the first outrage, the Volterrani immediately determined to send ambassadors to Florence, who intimated that if the Signory would allow them their ancient privileges, the city would remain subject to them as formerly. Many and various were the opinions concerning the reply to be made. Tommaso Soderini advised that they should accept the submission of the people of Volterra upon any conditions with which they were disposed to make it, for he considered it unreasonable and unwise to kindle a flame so near home that it might burn their own dwelling. He suspected the Pope's ambition and was apprehensive of the power of the king, nor could he confide in the friendship either of the Duke or the Venetians, having no assurance of the sincerity of the latter or the valor of the former. He concluded by quoting that trite proverb, "Meglio un magro accordo che una grassa vittoria." On the other hand, Lorenzo de' Medici, thinking this an opportunity for exhibiting his prudence and wisdom, and being strenuously supported by those who envied the influence of Tommaso Soderini, resolved to march against them and punish the arrogance of the people of Volterra with arms, declaring that if they were not made a striking example, others would, without the least fear or respect, upon every slight occasion, adopt a similar course. The enterprise being resolved on, the Volterrani were told that they could not demand the observance of conditions which they themselves had broken, and therefore must either submit to the direction of the Signory or expect war. With this answer they returned to their city and prepared for its defense, fortifying the place and sending to all the princes of Italy to request assistance, none of whom listened to them except the Sienese and the Lord of Piombino, who gave them some hope of aid. The Florentines, on the other hand, thinking success dependent principally upon celerity, assembled 10,000 foot and 2,000 horse, who, under the command of Federigo, Lord of Urbino, marched into the country of Volterra and quickly took entire possession of it. They then encamped before the city, which, being in a lofty situation and precipitous on all sides, could only be approached by a narrow pass near the church of St. Alessandro. The Volterrani had engaged for their defense about 1,000 mercenaries who, perceiving the great superiority of the Florentines, found the place untenable, and were tardy in their defensive operations, but indefatigable in the constant injuries they committed upon the people of the place. Thus these poor citizens were harassed by the enemy without and by their own soldiery within. So despairing of their safety, they began to think of a capitulation, and, being unable to obtain better terms, submitted to the discretion of the Florentine commissaries, who ordered the gates to be opened and introduced the greater part of their forces. They then proceeded to the palace and commanded the priors to retire to their homes. And on the way thither, one of them was in derision stripped by the soldiers. From this beginning, so much more easily are men predisposed to evil than to good, originated the pillage and destruction of the city, which for a whole day suffered the greatest horrors, neither women nor sacred places being spared, and the soldiery, those engaged for its defense, as well as its assailants, plundered all that came within their reach. The news of this victory was received with great joy at Florence, and as the expedition had been undertaken wholly by the advice of Lorenzo, he acquired great reputation, upon which one of the intimate friends of Tommaso Soderini, reminding him of the advice he had given, asked him what he thought of the taking of Volterra, to which he replied to me, "The place seems rather lost than won, for had it been received on equitable terms, advantage and security would have been the result, but having to retain it by force, it will in critical junctures occasion weakness and anxiety, and in times of peace, injury, and expense. Chapter 6, Book 7, The Pope, anxious to retain the territories of the Church in obedience, had caused Spoleto to be sacked for having, through internal factions, fallen into rebellion. Città di Castello being in the same state of contumacy, he besieged that place, and Niccolò Vitelli, its prince, being on intimate terms with Lorenzo de' Medici, obtained assistance from him, which, though inadequate, was quite enough to originate that enmity between Sixtus IV and the Medici, afterward productive of such unhappy results. Nor would this have been so long in development had not the death of Fra Piero, Cardinal of St. Sixtus, taken place, who, after having traveled over Italy and visited Venice and Milan, under the pretense of doing honor to the marriage of Ercole, Marquis of Ferrara, went about sounding the minds of the princes to learn how they were disposed toward the Florentines. But upon his return he died, not without suspicion of having been poisoned by the Venetians, who found they would have reason to fear Sixtus if he were allowed to avail himself of the talents and exertions of Fra Piero. Although of very low extraction and meanly brought up within the walls of a convent, he had no sooner attained the distinction of the scarlet hat than he exhibited such inordinate pride and ambition that the pontificate seemed too little for him. And he gave a feast in Rome, which would have seemed extraordinary even for a king, the expense exceeding 20,000 florins. Deprived of this minister, the designs of Sixtus proceeded with less promptitude. The Florentines, the Duke, and the Venetians, having renewed their league and allowed the Pope and the King to join them if they thought proper, the two latter also entered into a league, reserving an opening for the others if they were desirous to become parties to it. Italy was thus divided in two factions, for circumstances daily arose which occasioned ill feeling between the two leagues, as occurred with respect to the island of Cyprus, to which Ferrando laid claim, and the Venetians occupied. Thus the Pope and the King became more closely united. Federigo, Prince of Urbino, was at this time one of the first generals of Italy, and had long served the Florentines. In order, if possible, to deprive the hostile league of their captain, the Pope advised, and the King requested him to pay a visit to them. To the surprise and displeasure of the Florentines, Federigo complied, for they thought the same fate awaited him as had befallen Niccolò Piccinino. However, the result was quite different, for he returned from Naples and Rome greatly honored, and with the appointment of general to their forces. They also endeavored to gain over to their interest the lords of Romagna and the Sienese, that they might more easily injure the Florentines, who, becoming aware of these things, used their utmost endeavors to defend themselves against the ambition of their enemy, and having lost Federigo d'Urbino, they engaged Roberto da Rimino in his place, renewed the league with the Perugini, and formed one with the Prince of Faenza. The Pope and the King assigned, as the reasons of their animosity against the Florentines, that they wished to withdraw them from the Venetian alliance and associate them with their own league. For the Pope did not think the Church could maintain her reputation, nor the Count Girolamo retain the states of Romagna, while the Florentines and the Venetians remained united. The Florentines conjectured their design was to set them at enmity with the Venetians, not so much for the sake of gaining their friendship as to be able the more easily to injure them. 2 years passed away in these jealousies and discontents before any disturbance broke out. But the first which occurred, and that but trivial, took place in Tuscany, Braccio Perugia, whom we have frequently mentioned as one of the most distinguished warriors of Italy, left 2 sons, Otto and Carlo. The latter was of tender years, the former, as above related, was slain by the people of Val di Lamona. But Carlo, when he came to mature age, was by the Venetians out of respect for the memory of his father, and the hopes they entertained from himself, received among the condottieri of their republic. The term of his engagement having expired, he did not design to renew it immediately, but resolved to try if by his own influence and his father's reputation he could recover possession of Perugia. To this the Venetians willingly consented, for they usually extended their dominion by any changes that occurred in the neighboring states. Carlo consequently came into Tuscany, but found more difficulties in his attempt upon Perugia than he had anticipated, on account of its being allied with the Florentines, and desirous of doing something worthy of memory, he made war upon the Siennese, alleging them to be indebted to him for services performed by his father in the affairs of that republic, and attacked them with such impetuosity as to threaten the total overthrow of their dominion. The Siennese, ever ready to suspect the Florentines, persuaded themselves that this outrage had been committed with their cognizance, and made heavy complaints to the Pope and the King against them. They also sent ambassadors to Florence to complain of the injuries they had suffered, and adroitly intimated that if Carlo had not been secretly supported, he could not have made war upon them with such perfect security. The Florentines denied all participation in the proceedings of Carlo, expressed their most earnest wish to do everything in their power to put a stop to them, and allowed the ambassadors to use whatever terms they pleased in the name of the Signory, to command him to desist. Carlo complained that the Florentines, by their unwillingness to support him, had deprived themselves of a most valuable acquisition, and him of great glory, for he could have ensured them the possession of the whole territory in a short time, from the want of courage in the people, and the ineffectual provision they had made for their defense. He then withdrew to his engagement under the Venetians. But the Siennese, although delivered from such imminent peril by the Florentines, were still very indignant against them, considering themselves under no obligation to those who had delivered them from an evil to which they had first exposed them. While the transactions between the king and the pope were in progress, and those in Tuscany in a manner we have related, an event of greater importance occurred in Lombardy. Cola Montano, a learned and ambitious man, taught the Latin language to the youth of the principal families in Milan, either out of hatred to the character and manners of the duke, or from some other cause. He constantly deprecated the condition of those who live under a bad prince, calling those glorious and happy who had the good fortune to be born and live in a republic. He endeavored to show that the most celebrated men had been produced in republics and not reared under princes, that the former cherish virtue, while the latter destroy it, the one deriving advantage from virtuous men, while the latter naturally fear them. The youths with whom he was most intimate were Giovanni Andrea Lamponano, Carlo Visconti, and Girolamo Ugliato. And the wretched condition of those who were subject to him, and by constantly inculcating his principles, acquired such an ascendancy over their minds as to induce them to bind themselves by oath to effect the duke's destruction. As soon as they became old enough to attempt it, their minds being fully occupied with this design, which grew with their years, the duke's conduct and their own private injuries served to hasten its execution. Galeazzo was licentious and cruel, of both which vices he had given such repeated proofs that he became odious to all. Not content with corrupting the wives of the nobility, he also took pleasure in making it notorious, nor was he satisfied with murdering individuals, unless he effected their deaths by some unusual cruelty. He was suspected of having destroyed his own mother, for not considering himself prince while she was present, he conducted himself in such a manner as induced her to withdraw from his court, and, traveling toward Cremona, which she obtained as part of her marriage portion, she was seized with a sudden illness, and died upon the road, which made many think her son had caused her death. The duke had dishonored both Carlo and Girolamo in respect to their wives or other female relatives, and had refused to concede to Giovan Andrea possession of the monastery of Miramondo, of which he had obtained a grant from the Pope for a near relative. These private injuries increased the young men's desire for vengeance, and the deliverance of their country from so many evils. Trusting that whenever they should succeed in destroying the duke, many of the nobility and all the people would rise in their defense. Being resolved upon their undertaking, they were often together, which, on account of their long intimacy, did not excite any suspicion. They frequently discussed the subject, and in order to familiarize their minds with the deed itself, they practiced striking each other in the breast and in the side with the sheathed daggers intended to be used for the purpose. On considering the most suitable time and place, the castle seemed insecure, during the chase uncertain and dangerous, while going about the city for his own amusement, difficult if not impracticable, and at a banquet of doubtful result. They therefore determined to kill him upon the occasion of some procession or public festivity, when there would be no doubt of his presence. and where they might, under various pretexts, assemble their friends. It was also resolved that if one of their number were prevented from attending, on any account whatever, the rest should put him to death in the midst of their armed enemies. It was now the close of the year 1476, near Christmas, and as it was customary for the Duke to go upon St. Stephen's Day in great solemnity to the church of that martyr, they considered this the most suitable opportunity for the execution of their design. Upon the morning of that day, they ordered some of their most trusty friends and servants to arm, telling them they wished to go to the assistance of Giovanandrea, who, contrary to the wish of some of his neighbors, intended to turn a watercourse into his estate. But that before they went, they wished to take leave of the prince. They also assembled, under various pretenses, other friends and relatives, trusting that when the deed was accomplished, everyone would join them in the completion of their enterprise. It was their intention, after the Duke's death, to collect their followers together and proceed to those parts of the city where they imagined the plebeians would be most disposed to take arms against the Duchess and the principal ministers of state, and they thought the people, on account of the famine which then prevailed, would easily be induced to follow them, for it was their design to give up the houses of Secco Simonetta, Giovanni Botti, and Francesco Lucani, all leading men in the government, to be plundered, and by this means gain over the populace and restore liberty to the community. With these ideas, and with minds resolved upon their execution, Giovanandrea, together with the rest, were early at the church, and heard Mass together, after which Giovanandrea, turning to a statue of St. Ambrose, said, "O patron of our city, thou knowest our intention, and the end we would attain by so many dangers. Favor our enterprise, and prove by protecting the oppressed that tyranny is offensive to thee." To the Duke, on the other hand, when intending to go to the church, many omens occurred of his approaching death, for in the morning, having put on a cuirass, as was his frequent custom, he immediately took it off again, either because it inconvenienced him, or that he did not like its appearance. He then wished to hear Mass in the castle, and found that the priest who officiated in the chapel had gone to St. Stephen's, and had taken with him the sacred utensils. On this he desired the service to be performed by the Bishop of Como, who acquainted him with preventing circumstances. Thus, almost compelled, he determined to go to the church, but before his departure caused his sons, Giovan Galeazzo and Hermes, to be brought to him, whom he embraced and kissed several times, seeming reluctant to part with them. He then left the castle, and with the ambassadors of Ferrara and Mantua on either hand, proceeded to St. Stephen's the conspirators, to avoid exciting suspicion, and to escape the cold, which was very severe, had withdrawn to an apartment of the archpriest, who was a friend of theirs, but hearing the Duke's approach, they came into the church Giovanandrea and Girolamo, placing themselves upon the right hand of the entrance, and Carlo on the left. Those who led the procession had already entered, and were followed by the Duke, surrounded by such a multitude as is usual on similar occasions. The first attack was made by Lampognano and Girolamo, who, pretending to clear the way for the prince, came close to him, and grasping their daggers, which, being short and sharp, were concealed in the sleeves of their vests, struck at him. Lampognano gave him 2 wounds, one in the belly, the other in the throat. Girolamo struck him in the throat and breast. Carlo Visconti, being nearer the door and the Duke having passed, could not wound him in front, but with 2 strokes transpierced his shoulder and spine. These 6 wounds were inflicted so instantaneously that the Duke had fallen before anyone was aware of what had happened, and he expired, having only once ejaculated the name of the Virgin, as if imploring her assistance. A great tumult immediately ensued. Several swords were drawn, and as often happens in sudden emergencies, some fled from the church, and others ran toward the scene of tumult, both without any definite motive or knowledge of what had occurred. Those, however, who were nearest the Duke and had seen him slain, recognizing the murderers, pursued them. Giovanandrea, endeavoring to make his way out of the church, proceeded among the women, who, being numerous, and according to their custom, seated upon the ground, was prevented in his progress by their apparel. And being overtaken, he was killed by a Moor, one of the Duke's footmen. Carlo was slain by those immediately around him. Girolamo Oggiato passed through the crowd and got out of the church, but seeing his companions dead and not knowing where else to go, he proceeded home, where his father and brothers refused to receive him. His mother only, having compassion on her son, recommended him to a priest, an old friend of the family who, disguising him in his own apparel, led him to his house. Here he remained 2 days, not without hope that some disturbance might arise in Milan, which would contribute to his safety. This not occurring, and apprehensive that his hiding place would be discovered, he endeavored to escape in disguise, but being observed, he was given over to justice and disclosed all the particulars of the conspiracy. Girolamo was 23 years of age, and exhibited no less composure at his death than resolution in his previous conduct for being stripped of his apparel, and in the hands of the executioner who stood by with the sword unsheathed. Ready to deprive him of life, he repeated the following words in the Latin tongue in which he was well versed: Mors acerba, fama perpetua, stabit vetus memoria facti. The enterprise of these unfortunate young men was conducted with secrecy and executed with resolution, and they failed for want of the support of those whom they expected would rise in their defense. Let princes therefore learn to live, so as to render themselves beloved and respected by their subjects, that none may have hope of safety after having destroyed. And let others see how vain is the expectation which induces them to trust so much to the multitude, as to believe that even when discontented, they will either embrace or ward off their dangers. This event spread consternation all over Italy, but those which shortly afterward occurred in Florence caused much more alarm, and terminated a peace of 12 years' continuance, as will be shown in the following book, which, having commenced with blood and horror, will have a melancholy and tearful conclusion. Chapter 1. Book 8. This book, commencing between two conspiracies, the one at Milan already narrated, the other yet to be recorded, it would seem appropriate, and in accordance with our usual custom, were we to treat of the nature and importance of these terrible demonstrations. This we should willingly do had we not discussed the matter elsewhere, or could it be comprised in few words. But requiring much consideration, and being already noticed in another place, it will be omitted, and we shall proceed with our narrative. The government of the Medici, having subdued all its avowed enemies, in order to obtain for that family undivided authority, and distinguish them from other citizens in their relation to the rest, found it necessary to subdue those who secretly plotted against them, while Medici contended with other families, their equals in authority and reputation. Those who envied their power were able to oppose them openly without danger of being suppressed at the first demonstration of hostility. For the magistrates being free, neither party had occasion to fear till one or other of them was overcome. But after the victory of 1466, the government became so entirely centered in the Medici, and they acquired so much authority, that discontented spirits were obliged either to suffer in silence, or, if desirous to destroy them, to attempt it in secrecy and by clandestine means, which plots rarely succeed and most commonly involve the ruin of those concerned in them, while they frequently contribute to the aggrandizement of those against whom they are directed. Thus, the prince of a city attacked by a conspiracy, if not slain like the Duke of Milan, which seldom happens, almost always attains to a greater degree of power, and very often has his good disposition perverted to evil. The proceedings of his enemies give him cause for fear. Fear suggests the necessity of providing for his own safety, which involves the injury of others, and hence arise animosities and not unfrequently his ruin. Thus, these conspiracies quickly occasioned the destruction of their contrivers, and in time inevitably injure their primary object. Italy, as we have seen above, was divided into two factions, the Pope and the King on one side, on the other, the Venetians, the Duke, and the Florentines. Although the flames of war had not yet broken out, every day gave rise to some new occasion for rekindling them, and the Pope in particular, in all his plans endeavored to annoy the Florentine government. Thus Filippo de' Medici, Archbishop of Pisa. Being dead, Francesco Salviati, a declared enemy of the Medici, was appointed his successor, contrary to the wish of the Signory of Florence, who, being unwilling to give him possession, There arose between them and the Pope many fresh grounds of offense before the matter was settled. Besides this, he conferred, at Rome, many favors upon the family of the Pazzi, and opposed that of the Medici whenever an opportunity offered. The Pazzi were at this time, both on account of nobility of birth and their great wealth, the most brilliant in France. The head of this family was Jacopo, whom the people, on account of his distinguished preeminence, had made a knight. He had no children, except one natural daughter, but many nephews, sons of his brothers Piero and Antonio, the first of whom were Guglielmo, Francesco, Renato, Giovanni, and then Andrea, Niccolò. Cosmo de' Medici, noticing the riches and rank of this family, had given his granddaughter, Bianca, to Guglielmo, hoping by this marriage to unite the houses and obviate those enmities and dissensions so frequently occasioned by jealousy. However, so uncertain and fallacious are our expectations, very different feelings were thus originated, for Lorenzo's advisers pointed out to him how dangerous it was, and how injurious to his authority, to unite in the same individual so much wealth and power. In consequence, neither Jacopo nor his nephews obtained those degrees of honor, which, in the opinion of other citizens, were their due. This gave rise to anger in the Pazzi, and fear on the part of the Medici. As the former of these increased, so did the latter. And upon all occasions when the Pazzi came in competition with other citizens, their claims to distinction, however strong, were set aside by the magistracy. Francesco de' Pazzi, being at Rome the Council of Eight, upon some trivial occasion compelled him to return, without treating him with the respect usually observed toward great citizens. So that the Pazzi everywhere bitterly complained of the ill usage they experienced, and thus excited suspicion in others, and brought down greater evils upon themselves. Giovanni de' Pazzi had married the daughter of Giovanni Buonrome, a very wealthy man whose riches on his decease without other children came to his daughter. His nephew, Carlo, however, took possession of part, and the question being litigated, a law was passed, by virtue of which the wife of Giovanni de' Pazzi was robbed of her inheritance, and it was given to Carlo. In this piece of injustice the Pazzi at once recognized the influence of the Medici. Giuliano de' Medici often complained to his brother Lorenzo of the affair, saying he was afraid that by grasping it too much they would lose all. Lorenzo, flushed with youth and power, would assume the direction of everything, and resolved that all transactions should bear and impress of his influence. The Pazzi, with their nobility and wealth unable to endure so many affronts, began to devise some means of vengeance. The first who spoke of any attempt against the Medici was Francesco, who, being more sensitive and resolute than the others, determined either to obtain what was withheld from him, or lose what he still possessed. As the government of Florence gave him great offense, he resided almost constantly at Rome, where, like other Florentine merchants, he conducted extensive commercial operations. And being a most intimate friend of Count Girolamo, they frequently complained to each other of the conduct of the Medici. After a while, they began to think that, for the Count to retain his estates, or the Pazzi their rights in the city, it would be necessary to change the government of Florence. And this, they considered, could not be done without the death of Giuliano and Lorenzo. They imagined the Pope and the King would be easily induced to consent, because each could be convinced of the facility of the enterprise. Having acquired these ideas, they communicated them to Francesco Salviati, Archbishop of Pisa, who, being ambitious and recently offended by the Medici, willingly adopted their views. Considering their next step, they resolved, in order to facilitate the design, to obtain the consent of Jacopo de' Pazzi, without whose concurrence they feared it would be impracticable. With this view, it was resolved that Francesco de' Pazzi should go to Florence, while the Archbishop and the Count were to remain at Rome, to be ready to communicate with the Pope when a suitable opportunity occurred. Francesco found Jacopo de' Pazzi more cautious and difficult to persuade than he could have wished, and on imparting this to his friends at Rome, it was thought he desired the sanction of some greater authority to induce him to adopt their views. Upon this, the Archbishop and the Count communicated the whole affair to Giovanni Battista da Montesecco, a leader of the papal forces, possessing military reputation and under obligations to the Pope and the Count. To him, the affair seemed difficult and dangerous, while the archbishop endeavored to obviate his objections by showing how much assistance the pope and the king would lend to the enterprise. The hatred of the Florentines toward the Medici, the numerous friends the Salviati and the Pazzi would bring with them, the readiness with which the young men might be slain, on account of their going about the city unaccompanied and without suspicion, and the facility with which the government might then be changed. These things Giovanni Battista did not in reality believe, for he had heard from many Florentines quite contrary statements. While occupied with these deliberations, Carlo, Lord of Faenza, was taken ill, and tears were entertained for his life. This circumstance seemed to the archbishop and the count to offer an opportunity for sending Giovanni Battista to Florence, and thence to Romagna, under pretense of recovering certain territories belonging to the latter, of which the Lord of Faenza had taken possession. The count therefore commissioned Giovanni Battista to have an interview with Lorenzo de' Medici, and on his part request his advice how to proceed with respect to the affair of Romagna, that he should then see Francesco de' Pazzi, and in conjunction with him endeavor to induce his uncle Jacopo to adopt their ideas. To render the Pope's authority available in their behalf, Giovanni Battista was ordered, before his departure, to communicate with the Pontiff, who offered every means at his disposal in favor of their enterprise. Giovanni Battista, having arrived at Florence, obtained an interview with Lorenzo, by whom he was most graciously received, and with regard to the advice he was commissioned to ask, obtained a wise and friendly answer, so that he was astonished at finding him quite a different character from what he had been represented, and considered him to possess great sagacity, an affectionate heart, and most amicably disposed toward the count. He found Francesco de' Pazzi had gone to Lucca, and spoke to Jacopo, who was at first quite opposed to their design. But before they parted, the Pope's authority seemed to have influenced him, for he told Giovanni Battista he might go to Romagna, and that before his return Francesco would be with him, and they would then consult more particularly upon the subject. Giovanni Battista proceeded to Romagna, and soon returned to Florence. After a pretended consultation with Lorenzo upon the count's affairs, he obtained an interview with Francesco and Jacopo de' Pazzi, when the latter gave his consent to their enterprise. They then discussed the means of carrying it into effect. Jacopo de' Pazzi was of opinion that it could not be effected while both the brothers remained at Florence, and therefore it would be better to wait till Lorenzo went to Rome, whither it was reported he had an intention of going, for then their object would be more easily attained. Francesco de' Pazzi had no objection to Lorenzo being at Rome, but if he were to forego the journey, he thought that both the brothers might be slain either at a marriage, or at a play, or in a church. With regard to foreign assistance, he supposed the Pope might assemble forces for the conquest of the fortress of Mentone, being justified in taking it from Count Carlo, who had caused the tumults already spoken of in Siena and Perugia. Still, no definite arrangement was made, but it was resolved that Giovanni Battista and Francesco de' Pazzi should go to Rome and settle everything with the pontiff. The matter was again debated at Rome, and at length it was concluded that besides an expedition against Mentone, Giovan Francesco da Tolentino, a leader of the papal troops, should go into Romagna, and Lorenzo da Castello to the Val di Tavera, that each, with the forces of the country, should hold himself in readiness to perform the commands of the Archbishop de' Salviati and Francesco de' Pazzi, both of whom were to come to Florence and provide for the execution of their design. With the assistance of Giovanni Battista da Montesecco, King Ferrando promised by his ambassador to contribute all in his power to the success of their undertaking. Francesco de' Pazzi and the Archbishop, having arrived at Florence, prevailed upon Jacopo di Poggio, a well-educated youth, but ambitious and very desirous of change, to join them, and two others, each of the name of Jacopo Salviati, one a brother, the other a kinsman of the Archbishop. They also gained over Bernardo Bandini and Napoleone Franzeni, two bold young men under great obligations to the family of the Pazzi. Besides those already mentioned, they were joined by Antonio da Volterra and a priest named Stefano, who taught Latin to the daughter of Jacopo de' Pazzi, Renato de' Pazzi, a grave and prudent man. being quite aware of the evils resulting from such undertakings, refused all participation in the conspiracy. He held it in abhorrence, and as much as possible, without betraying his kinsmen, endeavored to counteract it. The Pope had sent Raffaello di Riario, a nephew of Count Girolamo, to the College of Pisa to study canon law, and while there had advanced him to the dignity of a cardinal. The conspirators determined to bring this cardinal to Florence, as they would thus be better able to conceal their design, since any persons requisite to be introduced into the city might easily be made to appear as a part of his retinue, and his arrival might facilitate the completion of their enterprise. The cardinal came and was received by Jacopo de' Pazzi at his villa of Montucci near Florence. By his means it was also intended to bring together Giuliano and Lorenzo, and whenever this happened, to put them both to death. They therefore invited them to meet the cardinal at their villa of Fiesole, but Giuliano, either intentionally or through some preventing cause, did not attend. And this design having failed, they thought that if asked to an entertainment at Florence, both brothers would certainly be present. With this intention, they appointed Sunday, the 26th of April, 1478, to give a great feast. And, resolving to assassinate them at table, the conspirators met on the Saturday evening to arrange all proceedings for the following day. In the morning, it was intimated to Francesco that Giuliano would be absent, on which the conspirators again assembled, and finding they could no longer defer the execution of their design, since it would be impossible among so many to preserve secrecy, they determined to complete it in the cathedral church of Santa Reparata, where the cardinal attending, the two brothers would be present as usual. They wished Giovanni Battista da Montesecco to undertake the murder of Lorenzo, while that of Giuliano was assigned to Francesco de' Pazzi and Bernardo Bandini. Giovanni Battista refused, either because his familiarity with Lorenzo had created feelings in his favor, or from some other reason, saying he should not have resolution sufficient to commit such a deed in a church, and thus add sacrilege to treachery. This caused the failure of their undertaking. For time pressing, they were compelled to substitute Antonio de Volterra and Stefano, the priest, 2 men, who, from nature and habit, were the most unsuitable of any. For if firmness and resolution joined with experience and bloodshed be necessary upon any occasion, it is on such as these, and it often happens that those who are expert in arms, and have faced death in all forms on the field of battle, still fail in an affair like this. Having now decided upon the time, they resolved that the signal for the attack should be the moment when the priest who celebrated high mass should partake of the sacrament, and that, in the meantime, the Archbishop de Salviati, with his followers, and Jacopo di Poggio should take possession of the palace, in order that the Signory, after the young men's death, should voluntarily, or by force, contribute to their assistance. Chapter 2, Book 8. The conspirators proceeded to Santa Reparata, where the cardinal and Lorenzo had already arrived. The church was crowded, and divine service commenced before Giuliano's arrival. Francesco de' Pazzi and Bernardo Bandini, who were appointed to be his murderers, went to his house, and finding him, they, by earnest entreaties, prevailed upon him to accompany them. It is surprising that such intense hatred, and designs so full of horror as those of Francesco and Bernardo, could be so perfectly concealed, for while conducting him to the church, and after they had reached it, they amused him with jests and playful discourse. Nor did Francesco forget, under pretense of endearment, to press him in his arms, so as to ascertain whether under his apparel he wore cuirass or other means of defense. Giuliano and Lorenzo were both aware of the animosity of the Pazzi, and their desire to deprive them of the government, but they felt assured that any design would be attempted openly, and in conjunction with the civil authority. Thus, being free from apprehension for their personal safety, both affected to be on friendly terms with them, the murderers being ready, each in his appointed station which they could retain without suspicion. On account of the vast numbers assembled in the church, the preconcerted moment arrived, and Bernardo Bandini, with a short dagger provided for the purpose, struck Giuliano in the breast, who, after a few steps, fell to the earth. Francesco de' Pazzi threw himself upon the body and covered him with wounds, while, as if blinded by rage, he inflicted a deep incision upon his own leg. Antonio and Stefano, the priest, attacked Lorenzo, and after dealing many blows, effected only a slight incision in the throat, for either their want of resolution, the activity of Lorenzo, who, finding himself attacked, used his arms in his own defense, or the assistance of those by whom he was surrounded. Rendered all attempts futile, they fled and concealed themselves, but being subsequently discovered, were put to death in the most ignominious manner, and their bodies dragged about the city. Lorenzo, with the friends he had about him, took refuge in the sacristy of the church. Bernardo Bandini, after Giuliano's death, also slew Francesco Nori, a most intimate friend of the Medici, either from some previous hatred or for having endeavored to render assistance to Giuliano. And not content with these murders, he ran in pursuit of Lorenzo, intending, by his own promptitude, to make up for the weakness and inefficiency of the others. But finding he had taken refuge in the vestry, he was prevented. In the midst of these violent and fearful deeds, during which the uproar was so terrible, that it seemed almost sufficient to bring the church down upon its inmates, the Cardinal Riario remained close to the altar, where he was with difficulty kept in safety by the priests, until the Signory, upon the abatement of the disturbance, could conduct him to their palace, where he remained in the utmost terror till he was set at liberty. There were at this time in Florence some people of Perugia whom party feuds had compelled to leave their homes, and the Pazzi, by promising to restore them to their country, obtained their assistance. The Archbishop de Salviati, going to seize the palace, together with Jacopo di Poggio and the Salviati, his friends, took these Perugini with him. Having arrived, he left part of his people below, with orders that when they heard a noise, they should make themselves masters of the entrance, while himself, with the greater part of the Perugini, proceeded above, and finding the Signory at dinner, for it was now late, was admitted after a short delay by Cesare Petrucci, the Gonfalonier of Justice. He entered with only a few of his followers, the greater part of them being shut up in the Cancelleria to which they had gone, whose doors were so contrived that upon closing they could not be opened from either side without the key. The Archbishop, being with the Gonfalonier, under pretense of having something to communicate on the part of the Pope, addressed him in such an incoherent and hesitating manner that the Gonfalonier at once suspected him, and rushing out of the chamber to call assistance, found Jacopo di Poggio, whom he seized by the hair of the head and gave into the custody of his attendants. The Signory, hearing the tumult, snatched such arms as they could at the moment obtained, and all who had gone up with the Archbishop, part of them being shut up and part overcome with terror, were immediately slain or thrown alive out of the windows of the palace, at which the Archbishop, the two Jacopi Salviati, and Jacopo di Poggio were hanged. Those whom the Archbishop left below, having mastered the guard and taken possession of the entrance, occupied all the lower floors, so that the citizens who in the uproar hastened to the palace were unable to give either advice or assistance to the Signory. Francesco de Pazzi and Bernardo Bandini, perceiving Lorenzo's escape and the principal agent in the enterprise seriously wounded, became immediately conscious of the imminent peril of their position. Bernardo, using the same energy in his own behalf that had served him against the Medici, finding all lost, saved himself by flight. Francesco, wounded as he was, got to his house and endeavored to get on horseback, for it had been arranged they should ride through the city and call the people to arms and liberty. But he found himself unable from the nature of his wound, and throwing himself naked upon his bed, begged Jacopo de Pazzi to perform the part for which he was himself incapacitated. Jacopo, though old and unaccustomed to such business, by way of making a last effort, mounted his horse, and with about 100 armed followers, collected without previous preparation, hastened to the piazza of the palace, and endeavored to assemble adherents by cries of people and liberty. But the former, having been rendered deaf by the fortune and liberty of the Medici, the latter was unknown in Florence, and he found no followers. The signors, who held the upper part of the palace, saluted him with stones and threats. Jacopo, while hesitating, was met by Giovanni Serristori, his brother-in-law, who upbraided him with the troubles he had occasioned, and then advised him to go home, for the people and liberty were as dear to other citizens as to himself. Thus deprived of every hope, Lorenzo being alive, Francesco seriously wounded and none disposed to follow him, not knowing what to do. He resolved, if possible, to escape by flight, and accompanied by those whom he had led into the piazza, left Florence with the intention of going into Romagna. In the meantime, the whole city was roused to arms, and Lorenzo de' Medici, accompanied by a numerous escort, returned to his house. The palace was recovered from its assailants, all of whom were either slain or made prisoners. The name of the Medici echoed everywhere, and portions of dead bodies were seen borne on spears and scattered through the streets, while everyone was transported with rage against the Pazzi and pursued them with relentless cruelty. The people took possession of their houses, and Francesco, naked as they found him, was led to the palace and hanged beside the archbishop and the rest. He could not be induced by any injurious words or deeds to utter a syllable, but regarding those around with a steady look, he silently sighed. Guglielmo de' Pazzi, brother-in-law to Lorenzo, fled to the latter's house, and by his innocence and the intercession of his wife, Bianca, he escaped death. There was not a citizen of any rank whatever who did not, upon this occasion, wait upon Lorenzo with an offer of his services, so great were the popularity and good fortune which this family had acquired by their liberality and prudence. Renato de' Pazzi was at his villa when the event took place, and on being informed of it, he endeavored to escape in disguise, but was arrested upon the road and brought to Florence. Jacopo de' Pazzi was taken while crossing the mountains of Romagna. For the inhabitants of these parts, having heard what had occurred, and seeing him in flight, attacked and brought him back to the city. Nor could he, though he frequently endeavored, prevail with them to put him to death upon the road. Jacopo and Renato were condemned within 4 days after the murder of Giuliano. And though so many deaths had been inflicted that the roads were covered with fragments of human bodies, not one excited a feeling of regret, except that of Renato. For he was considered a wise and good man, and possessed none of the pride for which the rest of his family were notorious. As if to mark the event by some extraordinary circumstance, Jacopo de' Pazzi, after having been buried in the tomb of his ancestors, was disinterred like an excommunicated person, and thrown into a hole at the outside of the city walls. From this grave he was taken, and with the halter in which he had been hanged, his body was dragged naked through the city, and as if unfit for sepulture on earth, thrown by the populace into the Arno, whose waters were then very high. It was an awful instance of the instability of fortune to see so wealthy a man, possessing the utmost earthly felicity, brought down to such a depth of misery, such utter ruin and extreme degradation. It is said he had vices, among which were gaming and profane swearing, to which he was very much addicted, but these seem more than balanced by his numerous charities, for he relieved many in distress, and bestowed much money for pious uses. It may also be recorded in his favor that upon the Saturday preceding the death of Giuliano, in order that none might suffer from his misfortunes, he discharged all his debts, and whatever property he possessed belonging to others. Either in his own house or his place of business, he was particularly careful to return to its owners. Giovanni Battista da Montesecco, after a long examination, was beheaded. Napoleone of Franzesi escaped punishment by flight. Guglielmo de' Pazzi was banished, and such of his cousins as remained alive were imprisoned in the fortress of Volterra. The disturbances being over and the conspirators punished, the funeral obsequies of Giuliano were performed amid universal lamentation, for he possessed all the liberality and humanity that could be wished for in one of his high station. He left a natural son, born some months after his death, named Giulio, who was endowed with that virtue and felicity with which the whole world is now acquainted, and of which we shall speak at length when we come to our own times, if God spare us. The people who had assembled in favor of the Pazzi under Lorenzo da Castello in the Val di Tavera, and under Giovan Francesco da Tolentino in Romagna, approached Florence, but having heard of the failure of the conspiracy, they returned home. The changes desired by the Pope and the King in the government of Florence, not having taken place, they determined to effect by war what they had failed to accomplish by treachery, and both assembled forces with all speed to attack the Florentine states, publicly declaring that they only wished the citizens to remove Lorenzo de' Medici, who alone of all the Florentines was their enemy. The king's forces had already passed the Tronto, and the popes were in Perugia, and that the citizens might feel the effect of spiritual as well as temporal weapons, the pontiff excommunicated and anathematized them. Finding themselves attacked by so many armies, the Florentines prepared for their defense with the utmost care. Lorenzo de' Medici, as the enemy's operations were said to be directed against himself alone, resolved first of all to assemble the signory and the most influential citizens in the palace, to whom, being above 300 in number, he spoke as follows: "Most excellent signors, and you, magnificent citizens, I know not whether I have more occasion to weep with you for the events which have recently occurred, or to rejoice in the circumstances with which they have been attended. Certainly, when I think with what virulence of united deceit and hatred I have been attacked, and my brother murdered, I cannot but mourn and grieve from my heart, from my very soul. Yet when I consider with what promptitude, anxiety, love, and unanimity of the whole city my brother has been avenged and myself defended, I am not only compelled to rejoice, but feel myself honored and exalted. For if experience has shown me that I had more enemies than I apprehended, it has also proved that I possess more warm and resolute friends than I could ever have hoped for. I must therefore grieve with you for the injuries others have suffered, and rejoice in the attachment you have exhibited toward myself. But I feel more aggrieved by the injuries committed, since they are so unusual, so unexampled, and, as I trust you believe, so undeserved on our part. Think, magnificent citizens, to what a dreadful point ill fortune has reduced our family, when among friends amidst our own relatives, nay, in God's holy temple, we have found our greatest foes. Those who are in danger turn to their friends for assistance. They call upon their relatives for aid, but we found ours armed and resolved on our destruction. Those who are persecuted, either from public or private motives, flee for refuge to the altars. But where others are safe, we are assassinated. Where parricides and assassins are secure, the Medici find their murderers. But God, who has not hitherto abandoned our house, again saved us, and has undertaken the defense of our just cause. What injury have we done to justify so intense desire of our destruction? Certainly those who have shown themselves so much our enemies never received any private wrong from us. For had we wished to injure them, they would not have had an opportunity of injuring us. If they attribute public grievances to ourselves, supposing any had been done to them, they do the greater injustices to you, to this palace, to the majesty of this government. By assuming that on our account you would act unfairly to any of your citizens, and such a supposition, as we all know, is contradicted by every view of the circumstances. For we, had we been able, and you had we wished it, would never have contributed to so abominable a design. Whoever inquires into the truth of these matters will find that our family has always been exalted by you, and from this sole cause that we have endeavored by kindness, liberality, and beneficence to do good to all. And if we have honored strangers, when do we ever injure our relatives? If our enemies' conduct has been adopted to gratify their desire for power, as would seem to be the case from their having taken possession of the palace and brought an armed force into the piazza, the infamous and detestable motive is at once disclosed. If they were actuated by envy and hatred of our authority, they offend you rather than us, for from you we have derived all the influence we possess. Certainly usurped power deserves to be detested, but not distinctions conceded for acts of kindness, generosity, and magnificence. And you all know that our family never attained any rank to which this palace and your united consent did not raise it. Cosmo, my grandfather, did not return from exile with arms and violence, but by your unanimous desire and approbation. It was not my father, old and infirm, who defended the government against so many enemies, but yourselves by your authority and benevolence defended him. Neither could I, after his death, being then a boy, have maintained the position of my house except by your favor and advice. Nor should we ever be able to conduct the affairs of this republic if you did not contribute to our support. Therefore, I know not the reason of their hatred toward us, or what just cause they have of envy. Let them direct their enmity against their own ancestors, who by their pride and avarice lost the reputation which ours, by very opposite conduct, were enabled to acquire. But let it be granted we have greatly injured them, and that they are justified in seeking our ruin. Why do they come and take possession of the palace? Why enter into league with the Pope and the King against the liberties of this republic? Why break the long-continued peace of Italy? They have no excuse for this. They ought to confine their vengeance to those who do them wrong, and not confound private animosities with public grievances. Hence it is that since their defeat our misfortune is the greater. For on their account the Pope and the King make war upon us, and this war, they say, is directed against my family and myself. And would to God that this were true! Then the remedy would be sure and unfailing, for I would not be so base a citizen as to prefer my own safety to yours. I would at once resolve to ensure your security, even though my own destruction were the immediate and inevitable consequence. But as the wrongs committed by princes are usually concealed under some less offensive covering, they have adopted this plea to hide their more abominable purpose. If, however, you think otherwise, I am in your hands. It is with you to do with me what you please. You are my fathers, my protectors, and whatever you command me to do, I will perform most willingly, nor will I ever refuse. When you find occasion to require it, to close the war with my own blood, which was commenced with that of my brother. While Lorenzo spoke, the citizens were unable to refrain from tears, and the sympathy with which he had been heard was extended to their reply, delivered by one of them in the name of the rest, who said that the city acknowledged many advantages derived from the good qualities of himself and his family, and encouraged them to hope that with as much promptitude as they had used in his defense and in avenging his brother's death, they would secure to him his influence in the government, which he should never lose while they retained possession of the country, and that their deeds might correspond with their words. They immediately appointed a number of armed men as a guard for the security of his person against domestic enemies. Chapter 3, Book 8. The Florentines now prepared for war by raising money and collecting as large a force as possible. Being in league with the Duke of Milan and the Venetians, they applied to both for assistance. As the Pope had proved himself a wolf rather than a shepherd, to avoid being devoured under false accusations, they justified their cause with all available arguments, and filled Italy with accounts of the treachery practiced against their government, exposing the impiety and injustice of the pontiff, and assured the world that the pontificate which he had wickedly attained, he would as impiously fill, for he had sent those whom he had advanced to the highest order of prelacy in the company of traitors and parricides, to commit the most horrid treachery in the church in the midst of divine service and during the celebration of the Holy Sacrament. And that then, having failed to murder the citizens, change the government, and plunder the city according to his intention, he had suspended the performance of all religious offices, and injuriously menaced and injured the republic with pontifical maledictions. But if God was just and violence was offensive to him, he would be displeased with that of his viceregent, and allow his injured people, who were not admitted to communion with the latter, to offer up their prayers to himself. The Florentines, therefore, instead of receiving or obeying the interdict, compelled the priests to perform divine service, assembled a council in Florence of all the Tuscan prelates under their jurisdiction, and appealed against the injuries suffered from the pontiff to a future general council. The Pope did not neglect to assign reasons in his own justification, and maintained it was the duty of a pontiff to suppress tyranny, depress the wicked, and exalt the good, and that this ought to be done by every available means, but that secular princes had no right to detain cardinals, hang bishops, murder, mangle and drag about the bodies of priests, destroying without distinction the innocent with the guilty. Notwithstanding these complaints and accusations, the Florentines restored to the Pope the cardinal whom they had detained, in return for which he immediately assailed them with his own forces and those of the king. The two armies, under the command of Alfonso, eldest son of Ferrando and Duke of Calabria, who had as his general Federigo, Count of Urbino, entered the Chianti, by permission of the Sienese, who sided with the enemy, occupied Rada with many other fortresses, and having plundered the country, besieged the Castellina. The Florentines were greatly alarmed at these attacks, being almost destitute of forces, and finding their friends slow to assist. For though the Duke sent them aid, the Venetians denied all obligation to support the Florentines in their private quarrels, since the animosities of individuals were not to be defended at the public expense. The Florentines, in order to induce the Venetians to take a more correct view of the case, sent Tommaso Soderini as their ambassador to the Senate, and, in the meantime, engaged forces and appointed Ercole, Marquis of Ferrara, to the command of their army. While these preparations were being made, the Castellina was so hard pressed by the enemy that the inhabitants, despairing of relief, surrendered after having sustained a siege of 42 days. The enemy then directed their course toward Arezzo and encamped before San Savino. The Florentine army, being now in order, went to meet them, and having approached within 3 miles, caused such annoyance that Federigo d'Urbino demanded a truce for a few days, which was granted, but proved so disadvantageous to the Florentines that those who had made the request were astonished at having obtained it, for had it been refused, they would have been compelled to retire in disgrace. Having gained these few days to recruit themselves as soon as they were expired, they took the castle in the presence of their enemy. Winter being now come, the forces of the Pope and King retired for convenient quarters to the Sienese territory. The Florentines also withdrew to a more commodious situation, and the Marquis of Ferrara, having done little for himself and less for others, returned to his own territories. At this time, Genoa withdrew from the dominion of Milan under the following circumstances. Galeazzo, at his death, left a son, Giovan Galeazzo, who, being too young to undertake the government, dissensions arose between Sforza, Lodovico Ottaviano, and Ascanio, his uncles, and the Lady Bona, his mother, each of whom desired the guardianship of the young duke. By the advice and mediation of Tommaso Soderini, who was then Florentine ambassador at the court of Milan, and of Secco Simonetta, who had been secretary to Galeazzo, the Lady Bona prevailed. The uncles fled. Ottaviano was drowned in crossing the Adda. The rest were banished to various places, together with Roberto Sanseverino, who in these disputes had deserted the duchess and joined the uncles of the duke. The troubles in Tuscany, which immediately followed, gave these princes hope that the new state of things would present opportunities for their advantage. They therefore quitted the places to which their exile limited them, and each endeavored to return home. King Ferrando, finding the Florentines had obtained assistance from none but the Milanese, took occasion to give the duchess so much occupation in her own government as to render her unable to contribute to their assistance. By means of Prospero Adorno, the Signor Roberto, and the rebellious uncles of the duke, he caused Genoa to throw off the Milanese yoke. The Castelletto was the only place left, confiding in which the duchess sent a strong force to recover the city. But it was routed by the enemy, and perceiving the danger which might arise to her son and herself if the war were continued, Tuscany being in confusion, and the Florentines in whom alone she had hoped themselves in trouble, she determined, as she could not retain Genoa in subjection, to secure it as an ally, and agreed with Battistino Fregoso, the enemy of Prospero Adorno, to give him the Castelletto, and make him Prince of Genoa, on condition that he should expel Prospero, and do nothing in favor of her son's uncles. Upon this agreement, Battistino, by the assistance of the Castelletto and of his friends, became Lord of Genoa, and, according to the custom of the city, took the title of Doge. The Sforzeschi and the Signor Roberto, being thus expelled by the Genoese, came with their forces into Lunigiana, and the Pope and the King, perceiving the troubles of Lombardy to be composed, took occasion with them to annoy Tuscany and the Pisan territory, that the Florentines might be weakened by dividing their forces. At the close of winter they ordered Roberto da San Severino to leave Lunigiana and march thither, which he did, and with great tumult plundered many fortresses and overran the country around Pisa. At this time ambassadors came to Florence from the emperor, the king of France and the king of Hungary, who were sent by their princes to the pontiff. They solicited the Florentines also to send ambassadors to the pope, and promised to use their utmost exertion to obtain for them an advantageous peace. The Florentines did not refuse to make trial, both for the sake of publicly justifying their proceedings, and because they were really desirous of peace. Accordingly, the ambassadors were sent, but returned without coming to any conclusion of their differences. the Florentines, to avail themselves of the influence of the King of France. Since they were attacked by one part of the Italians and abandoned by the other, sent to him as their ambassador Donato Acciajuoli, a distinguished Latin and Greek scholar, whose ancestors had always ranked high in the city. But while on his journey he died at Milan. To relieve his surviving family and pay a deserved tribute to his memory, he was honorably buried at the public expense. Provision was made for his sons, and suitable marriage portions given to his daughters and guide Antonio Vespucci, a man well acquainted with pontifical and imperial affairs, was sent as ambassador to the king in his stead. The attack of Signor Roberto upon the Pisan territory being unexpected, greatly perplexed the Florentines, for having to resist the foe in the direction of Siena, they knew not how to provide for the places about Pisa. To keep the Lucchese faithful and prevent them from furnishing the enemy, either with money or provisions, they sent as ambassador Piero di Gino Capponi, who was received with so much jealousy, on account of the hatred which that city always cherishes against the Florentines from former injuries and constant fear, that he was on many occasions in danger of being put to death by the mob, and thus his mission gave fresh cause of animosity rather than of union. The Florentines recalled the Marquis of Ferrara and engaged the Marquis of Mantua. They also as earnestly requested the Venetians to send them Count Carlo, son of Braccio, and Diofobo, son of Count Jacopo, and after many delays they complied. For having made a truce with the Turks, they had no excuse to justify a refusal, and could not break through the obligation of the League without the utmost disgrace. The counts, Carlo and Diofobo, came with a good force, and being joined by all that could be spared from the army, which, under the Marquis of Ferrara, held in check the Duke of Calabria, proceeded toward Pisa, to meet Signor Roberto, who was with his troops near the river Serchio, and who, though he had expressed his intention of awaiting their arrival, withdrew to the camp at Lunigiana, which he had quitted upon coming into the Pisan territory, while Count Carlo recovered all the places that had been taken by the enemy in that district. The Florentines, being thus relieved from the attack in the direction of Pisa, assembled the whole force between Colle and Santo Geminiano. But the army, on the arrival of Count Carlo, being composed of Sforzeschi and Bracceschi, their hereditary feuds soon broke forth, and it was thought that if they remained long in company, they would turn their arms against each other. It was therefore determined, as the smaller evil to divide them, to send one party, under Count Carlo, into the district of Perugia, and establish the other at Poggibonzi, where they formed a strong encampment in order to prevent the enemy from penetrating the Florentine territory. By this they also hoped to compel the enemy to divide their forces, for Count Carlo was understood to have many partisans in Perugia, and it was therefore expected either that he would occupy the place, or that the Pope would be compelled to send a large body of men for its defense. To reduce the pontiff to greater necessity, they ordered Niccolò Vitelli, who had been expelled from Città di Castello, where his enemy Lorenzo Vitelli commanded, to lead a force against that place, with the view of driving out his adversary and withdrawing it from obedience to the Pope at the beginning of the campaign. Fortune seemed to favor the Florentines, for Count Carlo made rapid advances in the Perugino, and Niccolò Vitelli, though unable to enter Castello, was superior in the field and plundered the surrounding country without opposition. The forces also at Poggibonzi constantly overran the country up to the walls of Siena. These hopes, however, were not realized, for in the first place Count Carlo died, while in the fullest tide of success, though the consequences of this would have been less detrimental to the Florentines had not the victory to which it gave occasion been nullified by the misconduct of others. The death of the Count being known, the forces of the Church, which had already assembled in Perugia, conceived hopes of overcoming the Florentines and encamped upon the lake, within 3 miles of the enemy. On the other side, Jacopo Guicciardini, commissary to the army, by the advice of Roberto da Rimino, who after the death of Count Carlo was the principal commander, knowing the ground of their sanguine expectations, determined to meet them, and coming to an engagement near the lake. Upon the site of the memorable rout of the Romans by Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, the papal forces were vanquished. The news of the victory, which did great honor to the commanders, diffused universal joy at Florence, and would have ensured a favorable termination of the campaign, had not the disorders which arose in the army at Poggibonzi thrown all into confusion, for the advantage obtained by the valor of the one was more than counterbalanced by the disgraceful proceedings of the other. Having made considerable booty in the Sienese territory, quarrels arose about the division of it between the Marquis of Mantua and the Marquis of Ferrara, who, coming to arms, assailed each other with the utmost fury. And the Florentines, seeing they could no longer avail themselves of the services of both, allowed the Marquis of Ferrara and his men to return home. Chapter 4, Book 8. The army being thus reduced, without a leader, and disorder prevailing in every department, the Duke of Calabria, who was with his forces near Siena, resolved to attack them immediately. The Florentines, finding the enemy at hand, were seized with a sudden panic. Neither their arms nor their numbers, in which they were superior to their adversaries, nor their position, which was one of great strength, could give them confidence. But observing the dust occasioned by the enemy's approach, without waiting for a sight of them, they fled in all directions, leaving their ammunition, carriages, and artillery to be taken by the foe. Such cowardice and disorder prevailed in the armies of those times that the turning of a horse's head or tail was sufficient to decide the fate of an expedition. This defeat loaded the king's troops with booty and filled the Florentines with dismay, for the city, besides the war, was afflicted with pestilence, which prevailed so extensively that all who possessed villas fled to them to escape death. This occasioned the defeat to be attended with greater horror, for those citizens whose possessions lay in the Val di Pesa and the Val d'Elsa, having retired to them, hastened to Florence with all speed as soon as they heard of the disaster, taking with them not only their children and their property, but even their laborers, so that it seemed as if the enemy were expected every moment in the city. Those who were appointed to the management of the war, perceiving the universal consternation, commanded the victorious forces in the Perugino to give up their enterprise in that direction, and march to oppose the enemy in the Val d'Elsa, who, after their victory, plundered the country without opposition. And although the Florentine army had so closely pressed the city of Perugia that it was expected to fall into their hands every instant, the people preferred defending their own possessions to endeavoring to seize those of others. The troops, thus withdrawn from the pursuit of their good fortune, were marched to San Casciano, a castle within 8 miles of Florence, the leaders thinking they could take up no other position till the relics of the routed army were assembled. On the other hand, the enemy being under no further restraint at Perugia, and emboldened by the departure of the Florentines, plundered to a large amount in the districts of Arezzo and Crotona, while those who under Alfonso, Duke of Calabria, had been victorious near Poggibonzi, took the town itself, sacked Vico and Certaldo, and after these conquests and pillagings encamped before the fortress of Colli, which was considered very strong, and as the garrison was brave and faithful to the Florentines, it was hoped they would hold the enemy at bay till the Republic was able to collect its forces. The Florentines being at Santo Casciano, and the enemy continuing to use their utmost exertions against Colli, they determined to draw nearer, that the inhabitants might be more resolute in their defense, and the enemy assail them less boldly. With this design they removed their camp from Santo Casciano to Santo Gimignano, about 5 miles from Col, and with light cavalry and other suitable forces were able every day to annoy the Duke's camp. All this, however, was insufficient to relieve the people of Colli, for having consumed their provisions, they were compelled to surrender on the 13th of November, to the great grief of the Florentines, and joy of the enemy, more especially of the Sienese, who, besides their habitual hatred of the Florentines, had a particular animosity against the people of Colli. It was now the depth of winter, and the weather so unsuitable for war, that the Pope and the King, either designing to hold out a hope of peace, or more quietly to enjoy the fruit of victories, proposed a truce for 3 months to the Florentines, and allowed them 10 days to consider the reply. The offer was eagerly accepted, but as wounds are well known to be more painful after the blood cools than when they were first received, this brief repose awakened the Florentines to a consciousness of the miseries they had endured, and the citizens openly laid the blame upon each other pointing out the errors committed in the management of the war, the expenses uselessly incurred, and the taxes unjustly imposed. These matters were boldly discussed not only in private circles, but in the public councils, and one individual even ventured to turn to Lorenzo de' Medici and say the city is exhausted and can endure no more war. It is therefore necessary to think of peace. Lorenzo was himself aware of the necessity, and assembled the friends in whose wisdom and fidelity he had the greatest confidence, when it was at once concluded that as the Venetians were lukewarm and unfaithful, and the Duke in the power of his guardians, and involved in domestic difficulties, it would be desirable by some new alliance to give a better turn to their affairs. They were in doubt whether to apply to the king or to the pope, but having examined the question in all sides, they preferred the friendship of the king as more suitable and secure, for the short reigns of the pontiffs, the changes ensuing upon each succession, the disregard shown by their church toward temporal princes, and the still greater want of respect for them exhibited in her determinations, render it impossible for a secular prince to trust a pontiff, or safely to share his fortune. For an adherent of the Pope will have a companion in victory, but in defeat must stand alone, while the pontiff is sustained by his spiritual power and influence. Having therefore decided that the king's friendship would be of the greatest utility to them, they thought it would be most easily and certainly obtained by Lorenzo's presence, for in proportion to the confidence they evinced toward him, the greater they imagined would be the probability of removing his impressions of past enmities. Lorenzo, having resolved to go to Naples, recommended the city and government to the care of Tommaso Soderini, who was at that time gonfaloniere of justice. He left Florence at the beginning of December, and having arrived at Pisa, wrote to the government to acquaint them with the cause of his departure. The Signory, to do him honor and enable him the more effectually to treat with the king, appointed him ambassador from the Florentine people, and endowed him with full authority to make such arrangements as he thought most useful for the Republic. At this time, Roberto da San Severino, with Lodovico and Ascanio, Sforza, their elder brother being dead, again attacked Milan, in order to recover the government, having taken Tortona, and the city and the whole state being in arms. The Duchess Bona was advised to restore the Sforzeschi, and to put a stop to civil contentions by admitting them to the government. The person who gave this advice was Antonio Tassino of Ferrara, a man of low origin who, coming to Milan, fell into the hands of the Duke Galeazzo, and was given by him to his duchess for her valet. He, either from his personal attractions or some secret influence after the duke's death, attained such influence over the duchess that he governed the state almost at his will. This greatly displeased the minister Secco, whom prudence and long experience had rendered invaluable, and who, to the utmost of his power, endeavored to diminish the authority of Tassino with the duchess and other members of the government. The latter, aware of this, to avenge himself for the injury and secure defenders against Secco, advised the duchess to recall the Sforzeschi, which she did without communicating her design to the minister, who, when it was done, said to her, "You have taken a step which will deprive me of my life, and you of the government." This shortly afterward took place, for Secco was put to death by Lodovico and Tassino, being expelled from the dukedom. The duchess was so enraged that she left Milan and gave up the care of her son to Lodovico, who, becoming sole governor of the dukedom, caused, as will be hereafter seen, the ruin of Italy. Lorenzo de' Medici had set out for Naples, and the truce between the parties was in force when, quite unexpectedly, Lodovico Fregoso, being in correspondence with some persons of Serezana, entered the place by stealth, took possession of it with an armed force, and imprisoned the Florentine governor. This greatly offended the Signory, for they thought the whole had been concerted with the connivance of King Ferrando. They complained to the Duke of Calabria, who was with the army at Siena, of a breach of the truce, and he endeavored to prove by letters and embassies that it had occurred without either his own or his father's knowledge. The Florentines, however, found themselves in a very awkward predicament, being destitute of money, the head of the Republic in the power of the king, themselves engaged in a long-standing war with the latter and the Pope, in a new one with the Genoese, and entirely without friends, for they had no confidence in the Venetians, and on account of its changeable and unsettled state, they were rather apprehensive of Milan. They had thus only one hope, and that depended upon Lorenzo's success with the king. Lorenzo arrived at Naples by sea, and was most honorably received, not only by Ferrando, but by the whole city, his coming having excited the greatest expectation. For it being generally understood that the war was undertaken for the sole purpose of effecting his destruction, the power of his enemies invested his name with additional luster, being admitted to the king's presence. He spoke with so much propriety upon the affairs of Italy, the disposition of her princes and people, his hopes from peace, his fears of the results of war, that Ferrando was more astonished at the greatness of his mind, the promptitude of his genius, his gravity and wisdom, than he had previously been at his power. He consequently treated him with redoubled honor, and began to feel compelled rather to part with him as a friend than detain him as an enemy. However, under various pretexts, he kept Lorenzo from December till March, not only to gain the most perfect knowledge of his own views, but of those of his city, for he was not without enemies, who would have wished the king to detain and treat him in the same manner as Jacopo Piccinino, and with the ostensible view of sympathizing for him, pointed out all that would, or rather that they wished should, result from such a course. At the same time opposing in the council every proposition at all likely to favor him. By such means as these the opinion gained ground, that if he were detained at Naples much longer, the government of Florence would be changed. This caused the king to postpone their separation more than he would have otherwise done, to see if any disturbance were likely to arise. But finding everything go quietly on, Ferrando allowed him to depart on the 6th of March, 1479, having, with every kind of attention and token of regard, endeavored to gain his affection, and formed with him a perpetual alliance for their mutual defense. Lorenzo returned to Florence, and upon presenting himself before the citizens, the impressions he had created in the popular mind surrounded him with a halo of majesty brighter than before. He was received with all the joy merited by his extraordinary qualities and recent services in having exposed his own life to the most imminent peril, in order to restore peace to his country. 2 days after his return, the treaty between the Republic of Florence and the king, by which each party bound itself to defend the other's territories, was published. The places taken from the Florentines during the war were to be taken up at the discretion of the king. The Pazzi confined in the Tower of Volterra were to be set at liberty, and a certain sum of money, for a limited period, was to be paid to the Duke of Calabria as soon as his peace was publicly known. The Pope and the Venetians were transported with rage. The Pope thought himself neglected by the king. The Venetians entertained similar ideas with regard to the Florentines, and complained that, having been companions in the war, they were not allowed to participate in the peace. Reports of this description being spread abroad, and received with entire credence at Florence, caused a general fear that the peace thus made would give rise to greater wars. And therefore the leading members of the government determined to confine the consideration of the most important affairs to a smaller number, and formed a council of 70 citizens, in whom the principal authority was invested. This new regulation calmed the minds of those desirous of change, by convincing them of the futility of their efforts. To establish their authority, they, in the first place, ratified the treaty of peace with the king, and sent as ambassadors to the Pope Antonio Ridolfi and Piero Nasi, but, notwithstanding the peace, Alfonso, Duke of Calabria, still remained at Siena with his forces, pretending to be detained by discords among the citizens, which, he said, had risen so high, that while he resided outside the city, they had compelled him to enter and assume the office of arbitrator between them. He took occasion to draw large sums of money from the wealthiest citizens by way of fines, imprisoned many, banished others, and put some to death. He thus became suspected not only by the Sienese, but by the Florentines of a design to usurp the sovereignty of Siena. Nor was any remedy then available, for the Republic had formed a new alliance with the king, and were at enmity with the Pope and the Venetians. This suspicion was entertained not only by the great body of the Florentine people, who were subtle interpreters of appearances, but by the principal members of the government, and it was agreed on all hands that the city never was in so much danger of losing her liberty, But God, who in similar extremities has always been her preserver, caused an unhoped-for event to take place, which gave the Pope, the King, and the Venetians other matters to think of than those in Tuscany. The Turkish Emperor, Mohammed II, had gone with a large army to the siege of Rhodes and continued it for several months. But though his forces were numerous and his courage indomitable, he found them more than equaled by those of the besieged, who resisted his attack with such obstinate valor that he was at last compelled to retire in disgrace. Having left Rhodes, part of his army under the Pasha Ahmet approached Verona, and either from observing the facility of the enterprise, or in obedience to his sovereign's commands, coasting along the Italian shores, he suddenly landed 4,000 soldiers, and attacked the city of Otranto, which he easily took plundered, and put all the inhabitants to the sword. He then fortified the city and port, and having assembled a large body of cavalry, pillaged the surrounding country. The king, learning this, and aware of the redoubtable character of his assailant, immediately sent messengers to all the surrounding powers to request assistance against the common enemy, and ordered the immediate return of the Duke of Calabria with the forces at Siena. This attack, however, it might annoy the Duke and the rest of Italy, occasioned the utmost joy at Florence and Siena. The latter, thinking it had recovered its liberty, and the former that she had escaped a storm which threatened her with destruction. These impressions, which were not unknown to the Duke, increased the regret he felt at his departure from Siena, and he accused fortune of having, by an unexpected and unaccountable accident, deprived him of the sovereignty of Tuscany. The same circumstance changed the disposition of the Pope, for although he had previously refused to receive any ambassador from Florence, he was now so mollified as to be anxious to listen to any overtures of peace, and it was intimated to the Florentines that if they would condescend to ask the Pope's pardon, they would be sure of obtaining it. Thinking it advisable to seize the opportunity, they sent 12 ambassadors to the pontiff, who on their arrival detained them under different pretexts before he would admit them to an audience. However, terms were at length settled, and what should be contributed by each in peace or war. The messengers were then admitted to the feet of the pontiff, who with the utmost pomp received them in the midst of his cardinals. They apologized for past occurrences, first showing they had been compelled by necessity, then blaming the malignity of others, or the rage of the populace and their just indignation, and enlarging on the unfortunate condition of those who are compelled either to fight or die, saying that since every extremity is endured in order to avoid death, they had suffered war, interdicts, and other inconveniences, brought upon them by recent events, that their republic might escape slavery, which is the death of free cities. However, if in their necessities they had committed any offense, they were desirous to make atonement, and trusted in his clemency, who, after the example of the blessed Redeemer, would receive them into his compassionate arms. The Pope's reply was indignant and haughty. After reiterating all the offenses against the Church during the late transactions, he said that, to comply with the precepts of God, he would grant the pardon they asked, but would have them understand that it was their duty to obey, and that upon the next instance of their disobedience, they would inevitably forfeit, and that most deservedly the liberty which they had just been upon the point of losing. For those merit freedom who exercise themselves in good works and avoid evil. That liberty improperly used injures itself and others, that to think little of God and less of his church is not the part of a free man, but a fool, and one disposed to evil rather than good, and to effect whose correction is the duty not only of princes, but of every Christian, so that, in respect of the recent events, they had only themselves to blame, who, by their evil deeds, had given rise to the war and inflamed it by still worse actions, it having been terminated by the kindness of others rather than by any merit of their own. The formula of agreement and benediction was then read, and, in addition to what had already been considered and agreed upon between the parties, the Pope said that if the Florentines wished to enjoy the fruit of his forgiveness, they must maintain 15 galleys armed and equipped at their own expense. As long as the Turks should make war upon the kingdom of Naples, the ambassadors complained much of this burden in addition to the arrangement already made, but were unable to obtain any alleviation, however, after their return to Florence. The Signory sent as ambassador to the Pope Guidantonio Vespucci, who had recently returned from France, and who by his prudence brought everything to an amicable conclusion, obtained many favors from the pontiff, which were considered as presages of a closer reconciliation. Having settled their affairs with the Pope, Siena being free, themselves released from the fear of the king by the departure of the Duke of Calabria from Tuscany, and the war with the Turks still continuing, the Florentines pressed the king to restore their fortresses, which the Duke of Calabria, upon quitting the country, had left in the hands of the Sienese. Ferrando, apprehensive that, if he refused, they would withdraw from the alliance with him, and by new wars with the Sienese deprive him of the assistance he hoped to obtain from the Pope, and other Italian powers consented that they should be given up, and by new favors endeavored to attach the Florentines to his interests. It is thus evident that force and necessity, not deeds and obligations, induce princes to keep faith. The castles being restored, and this new alliance established, Lorenzo de' Medici recovered the reputation which first the war and then the peace, when the king's designs were doubtful, had deprived him of. For at this period there was no lack of those who openly slandered him with having sold his country to save himself, and said that in war they had lost their territories, and in peace their liberty. But the fortresses being recovered, an honorable treaty ratified with the king, and the city restored to her former influence, the spirit of public discourse entirely changed in Florence, a place greatly addicted to gossip, and in which actions are judged by the success attending them, rather than by the intelligence employed in their direction. Therefore the citizens praised Lorenzo extravagantly, declaring that by his prudence he had recovered in peace what unfavorable circumstances had taken from them in war, and that by his discretion and judgment he had done more than the enemy with all the force of their arms. Chapter 5, Book 8. The invasion of the Turks had deferred the war which was about to break forth from the anger of the Pope, and the Venetians at the peace between the Florentines and the king. But as the beginning of that invasion was unexpected and beneficial, its conclusion was equally unlooked for and injurious. For Muhammad dying suddenly, dissensions arose among his sons, and the forces which were in Puglia being abandoned by their commander, surrendered Otranto to the king. The fears which restrained the Pope and the Venetians being thus removed, every one became apprehensive of new troubles. On the one hand was the league of the Pope and the Venetians, and with them the Genoese, Sienese, and other minor powers. On the other, the Florentines, the king, and the duke, with whom were the Bolognese and many princes. The Venetians wished to become lords of Ferrara, and thought they were justified by circumstances in making the attempt, and hoping for a favorable result. Their differences arose thus. The Marquis of Ferrara affirmed he was under no obligation to take salt from the Venetians, or to admit their governor, the terms of convention between them declaring that after 70 years the city was to be free from both impositions. The Venetians replied that so long as he held the Polesine, he was bound to receive their salt and their governor. The Marquis refusing his consent, the Venetians considered themselves justified in taking arms, and that the present moment offered a suitable opportunity, for the Pope was indignant against the Florentines and the king, and to attach the Pope still further, the Count Girolamo, who was then at Venice, was received with all possible respect, first admitted to the privileges of a citizen, and then raised to the rank of a senator, the highest distinctions the Venetian Senate can confer. To prepare for the war they levied new taxes, and appointed to the command of the forces Roberto da San Severino, who being offended with Lodovico, governor of Milan, fled to Tortona, whence, after occasioning some disturbances, he went to Genoa, and while there was sent for by the Venetians, and placed at the head of their troops. These circumstances becoming known to the opposite league, induced it also to provide for war. The Duke of Milan appointed as his general Federigo d'Urbino. The Florentines engaged Costanzo, lord of Pesaro, and to sound the disposition of the Pope, and know whether the Venetians made war against Ferrara with his consent or not, King Ferrando sent Alfonso, Duke of Calabria, with his army across the Tronto, and asked the pontiff's permission to pass into Lombardy to assist the Marquis, which was refused in the most peremptory manner. The Florentines and the king, no longer doubtful about the Pope's intentions, determined to harass him, and thus either compel him to take part with them or throw such obstacles in his way as would prevent him from helping the Venetians, who had already taken the field, attacked the Marquis overran his territory, and encamped before Figueroa, a fortress of the greatest importance. In pursuance of the design of the Florentines and the king, the Duke of Calabria, by the assistance of the Colonna family, the Orsini had joined the Pope, plundered the country about Rome and committed great devastation, while the Florentines, with Niccolò Vitelli, besieged and took Città di Castello, expelling Lorenzo Vitelli, who held it for the Pope, and placing Niccolò in it as Prince. The Pope now found himself in very great straits, for the city of Rome was disturbed by factions and the country covered with enemies. But acting with courage and resolution, he appointed Roberto Ramiro to take the command of his forces, and having sent for him to Rome, where his troops were assembled, told him how great would be the honor if he could deliver the church from the king's forces and the troubles in which it was involved, how greatly indebted, not only himself, but all his successors would be, and that not mankind merely, but God himself would be under obligations to him. The magnificent Roberto, having considered the forces and preparations already made, advised the Pope to raise as numerous a body of infantry as possible, which was done without delay. The Duke of Calabria was at hand and constantly harassed the country up to the very gates of Rome, which so roused the indignation of the citizens that many offered their assistance to Roberto, and all were thankfully received. The Duke, hearing of these preparations, withdrew a short distance from the city, that in the belief of finding him gone, the magnificent Roberto would not pursue him, and also in expectation of his brother Federigo, whom their father had sent to him with additional forces, but Roberto, finding himself nearly equal to the Duke in cavalry and superior in infantry, marched boldly out of Rome and took a position within 2 miles of the enemy. The Duke, seeing his adversaries close upon him, found he must either fight or disgracefully retire. To avoid a retreat unbecoming a king's son, he resolved to face the enemy, and a battle ensued, which continued from morning till midday. In this engagement, greater valor was exhibited on both sides than had been shown in any other during the last 50 years. Upward of 1,000 dead being left upon the field, the troops of the church were at length victorious, for her numerous infantry so annoyed the ducal cavalry that they were compelled to retreat, and Alfonso himself would have fallen into the hands of the enemy had he not been rescued by a body of Turks, who remained at Otranto, and were at that time in his service. The Lord of Rimino, after this victory, returned triumphantly to Rome, but did not long enjoy the fruit of his valor, for having during the heat of the engagement taken a copious draught of water, he was seized with a flux, of which he very shortly afterward died. The Pope caused his funeral to be conducted with great pomp, and in a few days sent the Count Girolamo towards Città di Castello to restore it to Lorenzo, and also endeavored to gain Rimino, which being, by Roberto's death, left to the care of his widow and a son who was quite a boy, his holiness thought might be easily won, and this certainly would have been the case, if the lady had not been defended by the Florentines, who opposed him so effectually as to prevent his success against both Castello and Rimino. While these things were in progress at Rome and in Romagna, the Venetians took possession of Figueroa and crossed the Po with their forces. The camp of the Duke of Milan and the Marquis was in disorder, for the Count of Urbino, having fallen ill, was carried to Bologna for his recovery, but died. Thus, the Marquis's affairs were unfortunately situated, while those of the Venetians gave them increasing hopes of occupying Ferrara. The Florentines and the King of Naples used their utmost endeavors to gain the Pope to their views, and not having succeeded by force, they threatened him with the council, which had already been summoned by the emperor to assemble at Basel, and by means of the imperial ambassadors and the cooperation of the leading cardinals, who were desirous of peace, the Pope was compelled to turn his attention toward effecting the pacification of Italy. With this view, at the instigation of his fears, and with the conviction that the aggrandizement of the Venetians would be the ruin of the Church and of Italy, he endeavored to make peace with the League, and sent his nuncios to Naples, where a treaty was concluded for 5 years between the Pope, the King, the Duke of Milan, and the Florentines, with an opening for the Venetians to join them if they thought proper. When this was accomplished, the Pope intimated to the Venetians that they must desist from war against Ferrara. They refused to comply and made preparations to prosecute their design with greater vigor than they had hitherto done. And having routed the forces of the Duke and the Marquis at Argenta, they approached Ferrara so closely as to pitch their tents in the Marquis's park. The League found they must no longer delay rendering him efficient assistance, and ordered the Duke of Calabria to march to Ferrara with his forces, and those of the Pope, the Florentine troops also moving in the same direction. In order to direct the operations of the war with greater efficiency, the League assembled a diet at Cremona, which was attended by the Pope's legate, the Count Girolamo, the Duke of Calabria, the Signor Lodovico Sforza, and Lorenzo de' Medici, with many other Italian princes. And when the measures to be adopted were fully discussed, having decided that the best way of relieving Ferrara would be to effect a division of the enemy's forces, the League desired Lodovico to attack the Venetians on the side of Milan, but this he declined for fear of bringing a war upon the Duke's territories, which it would be difficult to quell. It was therefore resolved to proceed with the united forces of the League to Ferrara, and having assembled 4,000 cavalry and 8,000 infantry, they went in pursuit of the Venetians, whose force amounted to 2,200 men at arms and 6,000 foot. They first attacked the Venetian flotilla, then lying upon the river Po, which they routed with the loss of above 200 vessels, and took prisoner Antonio Justiniano, the purveyor of the fleet. Finding all Italy united against them, endeavored to support their reputation by engaging in their service the Duke of Lorraine, who joined them with 200 men at arms. And having suffered so great a destruction of their fleet, they sent him, with part of their army, to keep their enemies at bay, and Roberto da San Severino to cross the Adda with the remainder, and proceed to Milan, where they were to raise the cry of the Duke and the Lady Bona, his mother, hoping by this means to give a new aspect to affairs there, believing that Lodovico and his government were generally unpopular. This attack at first created great consternation and roused the citizens in arms, but eventually produced consequences unfavorable to the designs of the Venetians, for Lodovico was now desirous to undertake what he had refused to do at the entreaty of his allies. Leaving the Marquis of Ferrara to the defense of his own territories, he, with 4,000 horse and 2,000 foot, and joined by the Duke of Calabria, with 12,000 horse and 5,000 foot, entered the territory of Bergamo, then Brescia, next that of Verona, and in defiance of the Venetians plundered the whole country, for it was with the greatest difficulty that Roberto and his forces could save the cities themselves. In the meantime, the Marquis of Ferrara had recovered a great part of his territories, for the Duke of Lorraine, by whom he was attacked, having only at his command 2,000 horse and 1,000 horse, could not withstand him. Hence, during the whole of 1483, the affairs of the League were prosperous. The winter having passed quietly over, the armies again took the field. To produce the greater impression upon the enemy, the League united their whole force, and would easily have deprived the Venetians of all they possessed in Lombardy, if the war had been conducted in the same manner as during the preceding year. For by the departure of the Duke of Lorraine, whose term of service had expired, they were reduced to 6,000 horse and 5,000 foot, while the Allies had 13,000 horse and 5,000 foot at their disposal. But, as is often the case where several of equal authority are joined in command, their want of unity decided the victory to their enemies. Federigo, Marquis of Mantua, whose influence kept the Duke of Calabria and Lodovico Sforza within bounds, being dead, differences arose between them, which soon became jealousies. Giovan Galeazzo, Duke of Milan, was now of an age to take the government on himself, and had married the daughter of the Duke of Calabria, who wished his son-in-law to exercise the government and not Lodovico. The latter, being aware of the Duke's design, studied to prevent him from effecting it. The position of Lodovico being known to the Venetians, they thought they could make it available for their own interests. and hoped, as they had often before done, to recover in peace all they had lost by war, and having secretly entered into treaty with Lodovico, the terms were concluded in August 1484. When this became known to the rest of the allies, they were greatly dissatisfied, principally because they found that the places won from the Venetians were to be restored, that they were allowed to keep Rovigo and the Polesine, which they had taken from the Marquis of Ferrara, and besides this retain all the preeminence and authority over Ferrara itself, which they had formerly possessed. Thus it was evident to everyone they had been engaged in a war which had cost vast sums of money, during the progress of which they had acquired honor, and which was concluded with disgrace. For the places wrested from the enemy were restored without themselves recovering those they had lost. They were, however, compelled to ratify the treaty on account of the unsatisfactory state of their finances, and because the faults and ambition of others had rendered them unwilling to put their fortunes to further proof. Chapter 6, Diade. Book 8. During these events in Lombardy, the Pope sent Lorenzo to invest Città di Castello for the purpose of expelling Niccolò Vitelli, the place having been abandoned to him by the League for the purpose of inducing the pontiff to join them. During the siege, Niccolò's troops were led out against the papal forces and routed them. Upon this, the Pope recalled the Count Girolamo from Lombardy, with orders first to recruit his army at Rome, and then proceed against Città di Castello. But thinking afterward that it would be better to obtain Niccolò Vitello as his friend than to renew hostilities with him, an arrangement was entered into by which the latter retained Città di Castello, and the Pope pacified Lorenzo as well as he could. He was induced to both these measures rather by his apprehension of fresh troubles than by his love of peace, for he perceived dissensions arising between the Colonnesi and the Orsini. In the war between the King of Naples and the Pope, the former had taken the district of Tagliacozzo from the Orsini and given it to the Colonnesi, who had espoused his cause. Upon the establishment of peace, the Orsini demanded its restoration by virtue of the treaty. The Pope had frequently intimated to the Colonnesi that it ought to be restored. But they, instead of complying with the entreaties of the Orsini, or being influenced by the Pope's threats, renewed hostilities against the former. Upon this, the pontiff, unable to endure their insolence, united his own forces with those of the Orsini, plundered the houses they possessed in Rome, slew or made prisoners all who defended them, and seized most of their fortresses. So that when these troubles were composed, it was rather by the complete subjugation of one party than from any desire for peace in the other. Nor were the affairs of Genoa or of Tuscany in repose, for the Florentines kept the Count Antonio da Marciano on the borders of Serezana, and while the war continued in Lombardy, annoyed the people of Serezana by inroads and light skirmishes. Agostino Fregoso, Doge of Genoa, trusting to Pagallo Fregoso, the archbishop, was taken prisoner with his wife and children by the latter, who assumed the sovereignty of the city. The Venetian fleet had attacked the kingdom of Naples, taken Gallipoli, and harassed the neighboring places. But upon the peace of Lombardy, all tumults were hushed, except those of Tuscany and Rome. For the Pope died in 5 days after its declaration, either in the natural course of things, or because his grief for peace, to which he was always opposed, occasioned his end. Upon the decease of the pontiff, Rome was immediately in arms. The Count Girolamo withdrew his forces into the castle, and the Orsini feared the Colonnesi would avenge the injuries they had recently sustained. The Colonnesi demanded the restitution of their houses and castles, so that in a few days robberies, fires, and murders prevailed in several parts of the city. The cardinals entreated the count to give the castle into the hands of the college, withdraw his troops, and deliver Rome from the fear of his forces, and he, by way of ingratiating himself with the future pontiff, obeyed, and retired to Imola. The cardinals, being thus divested of their fears, and the barons hopeless of assistance in their quarrels, proceeded to create a new pontiff, and after some discussion, Giovanni Battista Cibo, a Genoese cardinal of Malfetta, was elected, and took the name of Innocent VIII. By the mildness of his disposition, for he was peaceable and humane, he caused a cessation of hostilities, and for the present restored peace to Rome, the Florentines, after the pacification of Lombardy, could not remain quiet, for it appeared disgraceful that a private gentleman should deprive them of the fortress of Serezana, and as it was allowed by the conditions of peace, not only to demand lost places, but to make war upon any who should impede their restoration, they immediately provided men and money to undertake its recovery. Upon this, Agostino Fregoso, who had seized Serezana, being unable to defend it, gave the fortress to the Bank of St. Giorgio. As we shall have frequent occasion to speak of St. Giorgio and the Genoese, it will not be improper, since Genoa is one of the principal cities of Italy, to give some account of the regulations and usages prevailing there. When the Genoese had made peace with the Venetians after the Great War many years ago, the Republic, being unable to satisfy the claims of those who had advanced large sums of money for its use, conceded to them the revenue of the dogano or custom house, so that each creditor should participate in the receipts in proportion to his claim until the whole amount should be liquidated, and as a suitable place for their assembling. The palace over the dogano is assigned for their use. These creditors established a form of government among themselves, appointing a council of 100 persons for the direction of their affairs, and a committee of 8 who, as the executive body, should carry into effect the determinations of the council. Their credits were divided into shares, called luochi, and they took the title of the Bank or Company of St. Giorgio. Having thus arranged their government, the city fell into fresh difficulties, and applied to San Giorgio for assistance, which, being wealthy and well managed, was able to afford the required aid. On the other hand, as the city had at first conceded the customs, she next began to assign towns, castles, or territories as security for moneys received, and this practice has proceeded to such a length from the necessities of the state and the accommodation by the San Giorgio that the latter now has under its administration most of the towns and cities in the Genoese dominion. These the bank governs, and Protan every year sends its deputies appointed by vote without any interference on the part of the Republic. Hence, the affections of the citizens are transferred from the government to the San Giorgio on account of the tyranny of the former and the excellent regulations adopted by the latter. Hence also originate the frequent changes of the Republic, which is sometimes under a citizen and at other times governed by a stranger, for the magistracy and not the San Giorgio changes the government. So when the Fregosi and the Adorni were in opposition, as the government of the Republic was the prize for which they strove, the greater part of the citizens withdrew and left it to the victor. The only interference of the Bank of St. Giorgio is when one party has obtained a superiority over the other, to bind the victor to the observance of its laws, which up to this time have not been changed, for as it possesses arms, money, and influence, they could not be altered without incurring the imminent risk of a dangerous rebellion. This establishment presents an instance of what in all the republics, either described or imagined by philosophers, has never been thought of, exhibiting within the same community and among the same citizens liberty and tyranny, integrity and corruption, justice and injustice. For this establishment preserves in the city many ancient and venerable customs, and should it happen, as in time it easily may, that the San Giorgio should have possession of the whole city, the Republic will become more distinguished than that of Venice. Agostino Fregoso conceded Serezana to the San Giorgio, which readily accepted it, undertook its defense, put a fleet to sea, and sent forces to Pietrasanta to prevent all attempts of the Florentines, whose camp was in the immediate vicinity. The Florentines found it would be essentially necessary to gain possession of Pietrasanta, for without it the acquisition of Serezana lost much of its value, being situated between the latter place and Pisa, but they could not, consistently with the treaty, besiege it, unless the people of Pietrasanta or its garrison were to impede their acquisition of Serezana. To induce the enemy to do this, the Florentines sent from Pisa to the camp a quantity of provisions and military stores, accompanied by a very weak escort, that the people of Pietrasanta might have little cause for fear, and by the richness of the booty be tempted to the attack. The plan succeeded according to their expectation, for the inhabitants of Pietrasanta, attracted by the rich prize, took possession of it. This gave legitimate occasion to the Florentines to undertake operations against them. So leaving Serezana, they encamped before Pietrasanta, which was very populous, and made a gallant defense. The Florentines planted their artillery in the plain and formed a rampart upon the hill, that they might also attack the place on that side. Jacopo Guicciardini was commissary of the army, and while the siege of Pietrasanta was going on, the Genoese took and burned the fortress of Vada, and landing their forces plundered the surrounding country. Biongiani Gianfigliazzi was sent against them with a body of horse and foot and checked their audacity, so that they pursued their depredations less boldly. The fleet, continuing its efforts, went to Livorno, and by pontoons and other means approached the new tower, playing their artillery upon it for several days, but being unable to make any impression, they withdrew. In the meantime, the Florentines proceeded slowly against Pietrasanta, and the enemy, taking courage, attacked and took their works upon the hill. This was effected with so much glory, and struck such a panic into the Florentines, that they were almost ready to raise the siege, and actually retreated a distance of 4 miles, for their generals thought that they would retire to winter quarters, it being now October, and make no further attempt till the return of spring. When the discomfiture was known at Florence, the government was filled with indignation, and to impart fresh vigor to the enterprise, and restore the reputation of their forces, they immediately appointed Antonio Pucci and Bernardo del Neri commissaries, who, with vast sums of money, proceeded to the army, and intimated the heavy displeasure of the Signory, and of the whole city, if they did not return to the walls. And what a disgrace, if so large an army, and so many generals, having only a small garrison to contend with, could not conquer so poor and weak a place. They explained the immediate and future advantages that would result from the acquisition, and spoke so forcibly upon the subject that all became anxious to renew the attack. They resolved in the first place to recover the rampart upon the hill. And here it was evident how greatly humanity and condescension influenced the minds of soldiers, for Antonio Pucci, by encouraging one and promising another, shaking hands with this man and embracing that, induced them to proceed to the charge with such impetuosity that they gained possession of the rampart in an instant. However, the victory was not unattended by misfortune, for Count Antonio de Marciano was killed by a cannon shot. This success filled the townspeople with so much terror that they began to make proposals for capitulation, and to invest the surrender with imposing solemnity. Lorenzo de' Medici came to the camp, when, after a few days, the fortress was given up. It being now winter, the leaders of the expedition thought it unadvisable to make any further effort until the return of spring, more particularly because the autumnal air had been so unhealthy that numbers were affected by it. Antonio Pucci and Biongiani Gianzi were taken ill and died, to the great regret of all. So greatly had Antonio's conduct at Pietrasanta endeared him to the army. Upon the taking of Pietrasanta, the Lucchese sent ambassadors to Florence to demand its surrender to their republic on account of its having previously belonged to them, and because, as they alleged, it was in the conditions that places taken by either party were to be restored to their original possessors. The Florentines did not deny the articles, but replied that they did not know whether, by the treaty between themselves and the Genoese, which was then under discussion, it would have to be given up or not, and therefore could not reply to that point at present. But in case of its restitution, it would first be necessary for the Luccheses to reimburse them for the expenses they had incurred, and the injury they had suffered, in the death of so many citizens, and that, when this was satisfactorily arranged, they might entertain hopes of obtaining the place. The whole winter was consumed in negotiations between the Florentines and Genoese, which, by the Pope's intervention, were carried on at Rome, but not being concluded upon the return of spring. The Florentines would have attacked Serezana had they not been prevented by the illness of Lorenzo de' Medici, and the war between the Pope and King Ferrando. For Lorenzo was afflicted not only by the gout, which seemed hereditary in his family, but also by violent pains in the stomach, and was compelled to go to the baths for relief. The more important reason was furnished by the war, of which this was the origin. The city of L'Aquila, though subject to the kingdom of Naples, was in a manner free, and the Count di Montorio possessed great influence over it. The Duke of Calabria was upon the banks of the Tronto with his men-at-arms, under pretense of appeasing some disturbances among the peasantry, but really with a design of reducing L'Aquila entirely under the king's authority, and sent for the Count di Montorio as if to consult him upon the business he pretended then to have in hand. The Count obeyed without the least suspicion, and on his arrival was made prisoner by the Duke and sent to Naples. When this circumstance became known at L'Aquila, the anger of the inhabitants arose to the highest pitch. Taking arms, they killed Antonio Sentinello, commissary for the king, and with him some inhabitants known partisans of his majesty. The L'Aquilani, in order to have a defender in their rebellion, raised the banner of the church and sent envoys to the Pope to submit their city and themselves to him, beseeching that he would defend them as his own subjects against the tyranny of the king. The pontiff gladly undertook their defense, for he had both public and private reasons for hating that monarch. And Signor Roberto of San Severino, an enemy of the Duke of Milan, being disengaged, was appointed to take the command of his forces, and sent for with all speed to Rome. He entreated the friends and relatives of the Count di Montorio to withdraw their allegiance from the king, and induced the princes of Altamura, Salerno, and Bisinano to take arms against him. The king, finding himself so suddenly involved in war, had recourse to the Florentines and the Duke of Milan for assistance. The Florentines hesitated with regard to their own conduct, for they felt all the inconvenience of neglecting their own affairs to attend to those of others, and hostilities against the church seemed likely to involve much risk. However, being under the obligation of a league, they preferred their honor to convenience or security, engaged the Orsini, and sent all their own forces under the Count de Pitigliano toward Rome to the assistance of the king. The latter divided his forces into two parts. One, under the Duke of Calabria, he sent toward Rome, which, being joined by the Florentines, opposed the army of the church. With the other, under his own command, he attacked the barons, and the war was prosecuted with various success on both sides. At length, the king being universally victorious, peace was concluded by the intervention of the ambassadors of the King of Spain in August 1486, to which the Pope consented, for having found fortune opposed to him, he was not disposed to tempt it further. In this treaty, all the powers of Italy were united, except the Genoese, who were omitted as rebels against the Republic of Milan and unjust occupiers of territories belonging to the Florentines. Upon the peace being ratified, Roberto da San Severino, having been during the war a treacherous ally of the church, and by no means formidable to her enemies, left Rome, being followed by the forces of the Duke and the Florentines after passing Cesena, found them near him, and urging his flight, reached Ravenna with less than 100 horse. Of his forces, part were received into the Duke's service, and part were plundered by the peasantry. The king, being reconciled with his barons, put to death Jacopo Coppola and Antonello d'Aversa and their sons, for having during the war betrayed his secrets to the Pope. Chapter 7, Book 8. The Pope, having observed in the course of the war how promptly and earnestly the Florentines adhered to their alliances, although he had previously been opposed to them from his attachment to the Genoese, and the assistance they had rendered to the king, now evinced a more amicable disposition, and received their ambassadors with greater favor than previously. Lorenzo de' Medici, being made acquainted with this change of feeling, encouraged it with the utmost solicitude, for he thought it would be of great advantage if to the friendship of the king he could add that of the pontiff. The Pope had a son named Francesco, upon whom designed to bestow states and attach friends who might be useful to him after his own death, saw no safer connection in Italy than Lorenzo's, and therefore induced the latter to give him one of his daughters in marriage. Having formed this alliance, the Pope desired the Genoese to concede Serezana to the Florentines, insisting that they had no right to detain what Agostino had sold, nor was Agostino justified in making over to the Bank of San Giorgio what was not his own. However, His Holiness did not succeed with them, for the Genoese during these transactions at Rome armed several vessels, and unknown to the Florentines, landed 3,000 foot attacked Ceresinello, situated above Ceresana, plundered and burnt the town near it, and then, directing their artillery against the fortress, fired upon it with their utmost energy. This assault was new and unexpected by the Florentines, who immediately assembled their forces under Virginio Orsino at Pisa and complained to the Pope that while he was endeavoring to establish peace, the Genoese had renewed their attack upon them. They then sent Piero Corsini to Lucca, that by his presence he might keep the city faithful, and Pagal Antonio Soderini to Venice to learn how that republic was disposed. They demanded assistance of the king and of Signor Lodovico, but obtained it from neither. For the king expressed apprehensions of the Turkish fleet, and Lodovico made excuses, but sent no aid. Thus, the Florentines in their own wars are almost always obliged to stand alone, and find no friends to assist them with the same readiness they practiced toward others. Nor did they, on this desertion of their allies, it being nothing new to them, give way to despondency, for having assembled a large army under Jacopo Guicciardini and Pietro Vittori, they sent it against the enemy, who had encamped upon the river Maga, at the same time pressing Ceresinello with mines and every species of attack. The commissaries being resolved to relieve the place, an engagement ensued, when the Genoese were routed, and Lodovico del Fiesco, with several other principal men, made prisoners. The Ceresinesi were not so depressed at their defeat as to be willing to surrender, but obstinately prepared for their defense, while the Florentine commissaries proceeded with their operations, and instances of valor occurred on both sides. The siege being protracted by a variety of fortune, Lorenzo de' Medici resolved to go to the camp, and on his arrival the troops acquired fresh courage, while that of the enemy seemed to fail. For perceiving the obstinacy of the Florentines' attack, and the delay of the Genoese in coming to their relief, they surrendered to Lorenzo without asking conditions, and none were treated with severity, except 2 or 3 who were leaders of the rebellion. During the siege, Lodovico had sent troops to Pontremoli, as if with an intention of assisting the Florentines, but having secret correspondence in Genoa, a party was raised there, who by the aid of these forces gave the city to the Duke of Milan. At this time the Dutch made war upon the Venetians, and Bacalino of Osimo in the Marca caused that place to revolt from the Pope and assume the sovereignty. After a variety of fortune, he was induced to restore the city to the pontiff and come to Florence, where, under the protection of Lorenzo de' Medici, by whose advice he had been prevailed upon to submit, he lived long and respected. He afterward went to Milan, but did not experience such generous treatment, for Lodovico caused him to be put to death. The Venetians were routed by the Dutch near the city of Trento, and Roberta Severino, their captain, was slain. After this defeat, the Venetians, with their usual good fortune, made peace with the Dutch, not as vanquished, but as conquerors, so honorable were the terms they obtained. About this time there arose serious troubles in Romagna. Francesco d'Orso Furli was a man of great authority in that city, and became suspected by the Count Girolamo, who often threatened him. He consequently, living under great apprehensions, was advised by his friends to provide for his own safety by the immediate adoption of such a course as would relieve him from all further fear of the Count. Having considered the matter and resolved to attempt it, they fixed upon the market day at Furli as most suitable for their purpose, for many of their friends being sure to come from the country. They might make use of their services without having to bring them expressly for the occasion. It was the month of May, when most Italians take supper by daylight. The conspirators thought the most convenient hour would be after the Count had finished his repast. For his household being then at their meal, he would remain in the chamber almost alone. Having fixed upon the hour, Francesco went to the Count's residence, left his companions in the hall, proceeded to his apartment, and desired an attendant to say he wished for an interview. He was admitted, and, after a few words of pretended communication, slew him, and calling to his associates, killed the attendant. The governor of the place coming by accident to speak with the Count, and entering the apartment with a few of his people, was also slain. After this slaughter, and in the midst of a great tumult, the Count's body was thrown from the window, and with the cry of Church and Liberty, they roused the people, who hated the avarice and cruelty of the Count, to arms, and having plundered his house, made the Countess Caterina and her children prisoners. The fortress alone had to be taken to bring the enterprise to a successful issue, but the Castellan would not consent to its surrender. They begged the Countess would desire him to comply with their wish, which she promised to do, if they would allow her to go into the fortress, leaving her children as security for the performance of her promise. Conspirators trusted her and permitted her to enter, but as soon as she was within, she threatened them with death and every kind of torture in revenge for the murder of her husband. And upon their menacing her with the death of her children, she said she had the means of getting more, finding they were not supported by the Pope and that Lodovico Sforza, uncle to the Countess, had sent forces to her assistance. The conspirators became terrified, and taking with them whatever property they could carry off, they fled to Città di Castello. The Countess recovered the state and avenged the death of her husband with the utmost cruelty. The Florentines, hearing of the Count's death, took occasion to recover the fortress of Piancaldoli, of which he had formerly deprived them, and, on sending some forces, captured it. But Secco, the famous engineer, lost his life during the siege. To this disturbance in Romagna, another in that province no less important has to be added. Galato, Lord of Faenza, had married the daughter of Giovanni Bentivogli, Prince of Bologna. She, either through jealousy or ill treatment by her husband, or from the depravity of her own nature, hated him to such a degree that she determined to deprive him of his possessions and his life, and pretending sickness, she took to her bed, where, having induced Galato to visit her, he was slain by assassins whom she had concealed for that purpose in the apartment. She had acquainted her father with her design, and he hoped on his son-in-law's death to become Lord of Faenza. A great tumult arose as soon as the murder was known. The widow, with an infant son, fled into the fortress. The people took up arms. Giovanni Bentivogli, with a condottiere of the Duke of Milan, named Bergamino, engaged for the occasion, entered Faenza with a considerable force, and Antonio Boscoli, the Florentine commissary, was also there. These leaders being together, and discoursing of the government of the place, the men of Val di Lamona, who had risen unanimously upon learning what had occurred, attacked Giovanni and Bergamino, the latter of whom they slew, made the former prisoner, and raising the cry of Astor and the Florentines, offered the city to the commissary. These events, being known at Florence, gave general offense. However, they set Giovanni and his daughter at liberty, and by the universal desire of the people, took the city and Astor under their protection. Besides these, after the principal differences of the greater powers were composed, during several years tumults prevailed in Romagna, the Marca, and Siena, which, as they are unimportant, it will be needless to recount, when the Duke of Calabria. After the War of 1478 had left the country, the distractions of Siena became more frequent, and after many changes in which first the plebeians and then the nobility were victorious, the latter at length maintained the superiority, and among them Pandolfo and Jacopo Petrucci obtained the greatest influence, so that, the former being distinguished for prudence and the latter for resolution, they became almost princes in the city. The Florentines, after the War of Serezana, lived in great prosperity until 1492, when Lorenzo de' Medici died, for he, having put a stop to the internal wars of Italy, and by his wisdom and authority established peace, turned his thoughts to the advancement of his own and the city's interests, and married Piero, his eldest son, to Alfonsina, daughter of the Cavalier Orsino. He caused Giovanni, his second son, to be raised to the dignity of cardinal. This was the more remarkable from its being unprecedented, for he was only 14 years of age when admitted to the college, and became the medium by which his family attained to the highest earthly glory. He was unable to make any particular provision for Giuliano, his third son, on account of his tender years and the shortness of his own life. Of his daughters, one married Jacopo Salviati, another Francesco Cibo, the third Piero Ridolfi, and the fourth, whom, in order to keep his house united, he had married to Giovanni de' Medici, died. In his commercial affairs he was very unfortunate. From the improper conduct of his agents, who in all their proceedings assumed the deportment of princes rather than of private persons, so that in many places much of his property was wasted, and he had to be relieved by his country with large sums of money. To avoid similar inconvenience, he withdrew from mercantile pursuits and invested his property in land and houses as being less liable to vicissitude. In the districts of Prato, Pisa, and the Val di Pesa, he purchased extensively and erected buildings which, for magnificence and utility, were quite of regal character. He next undertook the improvement of the city, and as many parts were unoccupied by buildings, he caused new streets to be erected in them, of great beauty, and thus enlarged the accommodation of the inhabitants. To enjoy his power in security and repose, and conquer or resist his enemies at a distance, in the direction of Bologna, he fortified the castle of Firenzuola, situated in the midst of the Apennines. Towards Siena he commenced the restoration and fortification of the Poggio Imperiale, and he shut out the enemy in the direction of Genoa by the acquisition of Pietrasanta and Serezana. For the greater safety of the city, he kept in pay the Baglioni at Perugia and the Vitelli at Città di Castello, and held the government of Faenza wholly in his own power, all which greatly contributed to the repose and prosperity of Florence. In peaceful times he frequently entertained the people with feasts and exhibitions of various events and triumphs of antiquity, his object being to keep the city abundantly supplied, the people united, and the nobility honored. He was a great admirer of excellence in the arts, and a patron of literary men, of which Agnolo da Montepulciano, Cristofero Landini, and Demetrius Chalcondylas, a Greek, may afford sufficient proofs. On this account, Count Giovanni della Mirandola, a man of almost supernatural genius, after visiting every court of Europe, induced by the munificence of Lorenzo, established his abode at Florence. He took great delight in architecture, music, and poetry, many of his comments and poetical compositions still remaining. To facilitate the study of literature to the youth of Florence, he opened a university at Pisa, which was conducted by the most distinguished men in Italy. For Mariano da Cinazzano, a friar of the order of St. Augustine and an excellent preacher, he built a monastery in the neighborhood of Florence. He enjoyed much favor both from fortune and from the Almighty. All his enterprises were brought to a prosperous termination, while his enemies were unfortunate, for besides the conspiracy of the Pazzi, an attempt was made to murder him in the Carmine by Battista Frescobaldi, and a similar one by Baldinetto da Pistoia at his villa. But these persons, with their confederates, came to the end their crimes deserved. His skill, prudence, and fortune were acknowledged with admiration, not only by the princes of Italy, but by those of distant countries, for Matthias, king of Hungary, gave him many proofs of his regard. The Sultan sent ambassadors to him with valuable presents, and the Turkish emperor placed in his hands Bernardo Bandini, the murderer of his brother. These circumstances raised his fame throughout Italy, and his reputation for prudence constantly increased. For in council he was eloquent and acute, wise in determination, and prompt and resolute in execution. Nor can vices be alleged against him to sully so many virtues, though he was fond of women, pleased with the company of facetious and satirical men, and amused with the games of the nursery, more than seemed consistent with so great a character. For he was frequently seen playing with his children, and partaking of their infantine sports, so that whoever considers his gravity and cheerfulness will find united in him dispositions which seem almost incompatible with each other. In his later years he was greatly afflicted. Besides the gout, he was troubled with excruciating pains in the stomach, of which he died in April 1492, in the 44th year of his age, nor was there ever in Florence, or even in Italy, one so celebrated for wisdom, or for whose loss such universal regret was felt. As from his death, the greatest devastation would shortly ensue. The heavens gave many evident tokens of its approach, among other signs. The highest pinnacle of the church of Santa Reparata was struck with lightning, and great part of it thrown down, to the terror and amazement of everyone. The citizens and all the princes of Italy mourned for him, and sent their ambassadors to Florence to condole with the city on the occasion, and the justness of their grief was shortly after apparent, for being deprived of his counsel, his survivors were unable either to satisfy or restrain the ambition of Lodovico Sforza, tutor to the Duke of Milan, and hence, soon after the death of Lorenzo, those evil plants began to germinate, which in a little time ruined Italy. and continue to keep her in desolation.